Alright, Catching Fire opens with Katniss in the woods mourning the life she lived prior to being abducted and forced to fight for her life in the 74th annual Hunger Games. More than feeling like she no longer has any idea who she is, she's constantly grappling with guilt, self-loathing, and despair. She feels that she has wronged her district, her loved ones, Gale, the entire country by defying Claudius Templesmith's orders that she murder Peeta. And by pulling out those berries. What she's actually done is the impossible. She managed to get herself and Peeta both crowned the victors of the 74th annual Hunger Games, and for the first time ever, bring home 2 tributes, thereby doubling the district's lifelong history of victors. Like most victors or survivors of the Hunger Games, she's probably meant to spend the rest of her life racked with self-loathing and guilt. And one of the weapons or whips she uses for self-flagellation is Gale Hawthorne. She says that her and Gale have maintained their relationship, but it's not like before, when they used to be able to tell each other anything. And that's because, despite the fact that she was abducted and forced to fight for her life, while simultaneously expected and forced to participate in this faux relationship with a near stranger that does include romantic, intimate, sexual contact on camera that is then broadcasted and mandatorily viewed by the entire nation, her best friend and hunting partner, who perhaps felt some sort of claim on her that was thwarted by this faux relationship, despite the fact that prior to her abduction, her relationship with her best friend was completely unromantic. She tells us that she's sure plenty of people assumed that they'd eventually get married, even if she had never given it any thought. Despite her reassurances that this was not real and was very much for the cameras, was not at all her idea and something that she had to participate in an effort to survive, Gale wants some sort of answer. Gale spends nearly every conversation that he has with Katniss throughout the majority of this book, non-verbally or otherwise, demanding something from her, whether it be answers or action. I'm pretty frustrated by this for a lot of reasons, but the main one is that Katniss is in a lot of pain, and she's been in a lot of pain since she was at least 11 years old. And the only person she has been able to share or confide that pain in is now one of the primary sources of pain in her life when she most needs support and comfort. So to hear that the person that's supposed to be her most trusted confidant can't hear her when she tells him that she has no room for romance because the only thing she's felt since Prim's name has been drawn in the reaping is fear, the fact that this is not registering or clicking with him, or that he seems to discard this information, indicates to me that he's not really her friend at all. It just sucks because the games didn't ruin Katniss and Gale's relationship. Gale did, by insisting consistently that she make a choice that has been stripped from her by the president of the nation. She tells us that it was clear that none of their relationship was strategy for Peeta and it was entirely real, which isn't actually true, right? Because his disclosure of the relationship is definitely strategy, but his feelings are real. She says she's not sure what it was for her, but she knows now that it was nothing but painful for Gale. She was in the Hunger Games. She was 16 years old. Like, come on. Their relationship has also changed in another really big way. It's not just that there's all this awkward tension between them now, but now Gale works in the coal mines for 12 hours a day, and he only gets one day off, and that's Sundays, so they tend to disappear into the woods together on those Sundays. So Gale has turned 18 and now is forced to work in the mines. This has left Katniss with the primary hunting responsibility. She's now keeping Gale's family, his mom Hazel, particularly in game and in coin. That way Gale's siblings can get fed. It's unclear what the situation is as it relates to work in the mine. It's obviously the only official job that anyone that comes from the seam or anyone that isn't born into like a town job position would be able to acquire, but I'm not sure if it mandated that Gale work in the mines. I don't know. It's never explained. So she keeps the other boys, 12-year-old Rory and 10-year-old Vic, and the baby, 4-year-old Posey, in game so that they will never have to sign up for Tesserae. We also learned that the Capitol has recast Gale in the role of Katniss's life. He's now known as her cousin, and everyone in the district, despite the fact that they all seem to think they were going to get married one day, has gone along with this lie or buys it that Gale is now Katniss's cousin. She says it's totally plausible because they have that seam look. Dark straight hair, olive skin, gray eyes. Apparently, he was too handsome, too male, and not the least bit willing to smile and play nice for the cameras. Families that have been brave enough to have rebellious ideas and the children of those rebels do not simper to capital games. They can't say, well, the star-crossed lovers is like their main strategy, that Gale is her best friend, because everyone assumes that they'd be in some sort of romantic relationship because Gale is super hot. But again, it's not Katniss that has evaluated Gale as handsome. It's everyone around her. Katniss is ruminating on all of this. She's loath to return home to Victor's village and her new life as a celebrity and person of pretty extreme wealth. We learn that the monthly salary for a Victor is enough to keep a full family fed for an entire year. So like when I say extreme wealth, I mean extreme wealth. We also learned that her old home that her, Prim, and her mom used to occupy sits empty right now because technically it's still the dwelling that her mom and Prim are assigned. We learned that if Katniss were to perish in any sort of way, her mother and Prim would be forced to return to this dwelling upon her death. None of her wealth or winnings would be inherited either. Let's talk about autism really quickly. You asked for meltdowns and stims, and I'm prepared to deliver them. But first, I want to talk about the fact that Katniss wears the same outfit every day and she wears her hair the same way every single day. Now, before she acquired all this wealth, we could not attribute this to autism or rigidity or routine. We might just attribute it to scarcity. But she tells us that when she goes out in the woods, she stops at her old dwelling to change back into her father's hunting jacket and her old boots. When she redons the expensive jacket and the expensive shoes that her mom has purchased for her, she tells us that the jacket is tight around the shoulders. She's not used to the fabric. She doesn't like it. She doesn't feel like she can move or be herself in it. She also tells us that the shoes pinch her toes. And that's not likely because they don't fit, right? We know that she can afford shoes that fit. It's more likely that she's got specific sensitivities to fabric, and her old clothes didn't bother her in the way that these new ones do. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is because neurotypical brains go through something called synaptic pruning. Neurodivergent brains don't. Babies are often overstimulated, right? And that's because they haven't yet gone through the process of synaptic pruning. Before they turn 2 years old, their brain goes through this process and snips off all the extra synapses that are making participation in life too painful or too hard. Neurodivergent brains don't go through this process. That is often why neurodivergent people are called hypersensitive or oversensitive, when in actuality, it's neurotypical brains that are dulled. So, not going through synaptic pruning means that all the synapses that we were born with, we keep our baby brains, so to speak, which is why we are often so sensitive to light, smell, touch, and energy. I'm bringing this up because not only does Katniss express a sensitivity to certain fabrics, but she's an excellent hunter. Gale says she's the best hunter that he knows. That doesn't really mean anything though, because in District 12, I don't know that another hunter exists outside of Gale, obviously. She tells us that she can shoot an animal in almost complete darkness and still take it down with one arrow. This obviously could be hypervigilance, a trauma response. I hear you on that. And it could also be this hypersensitivity. She simply could be more intuitive. Her instincts could be more intact because she has more sensory awareness than the average person or than 98% of the population. And it's also relevant, I hear you, that yes, CPTSD, complex PTSD, can manifest in symptoms that are similar to neurodivergence. That being said, there is also a certain trauma acquired by neurodivergent people that live their lives undiagnosed. So not only is Katniss probably suffering from, yes, CPTSD because of the life she's lived under a police state, because of the loss of her father, because of being parentified by her mother and ultimately losing her mother in the same year. She's now also suffering from PTSD because of the very specific enormous traumatic event that took place last year in the Hunger Games. And there's this other layer of trauma that comes with being a neurodivergent person who has not been diagnosed as neurodivergent. Something that is specific, exclusive to people with autism, but it's this belief that you are alien or wrong in some way. It leaves one with an unexplainable otherness, a deep shame for being unable to intuit and subsequently understand social convention that everyone else around you seems to understand quite inherently. It leaves you feeling wrong. And that can also manifest not just as symptoms of depression and social anxiety and generalized anxiety, but also with a sort of defensiveness as it relates to participation in social convention. Katniss has decided that people don't like her. And while that's probably not the truth, because it does seem like she's quite beloved in her district, she doesn't get along with people very well. So yes, Katniss is likely experiencing symptoms of CPTSD, general PTSD, and I believe autism. The only real way to know is to figure out if she exhibited any of these symptoms prior to any trauma taking place, if that time has ever existed inside of a police state. So I will keep trying to convince you with the evidence that I believe we have. Anyway, so Katniss has gone from the woods to Hazel's house to drop off game and some coin. She goes from Hazel's house to the Hob. She says, although they never mention it, I owe the people who frequent the Hob. Greasy Say, the old woman who serves up soup, started a collection to sponsor Peeta and me during the games. She says, couldn't have been much, but for all she knows, it made the difference between life and death. This character, Greasy Say, which damn. Does everyone call her Greasy Say? Greasy Say is sort of like an advocate or someone that Katniss and Gale used to work with really regularly in their previous life. She would buy or trade for her and Gale's game, regardless of how beraggled it might have been. She's not picky, she can make do, she'll throw it into a stew and she won't tell people what it really is. So, Katniss is at the counter, at Greasy Say's counter, when she's greeted by Darius, her favorite peacekeeper. And then we get what is perhaps the lightest and most heartwarming exchange of the entire series. Darius is sitting next to her and he flicks her braid and says shouldn't you be prettier if you're going on this victory tour today? We'll talk about the victory tour in a second. She says, yeah, my prep team's on the way. And we know that that's going to be a pretty unpleasant experience, but Darius is teasing her in a way that feels like love. He says, good. Let's show a little district pride for a change, Miss Everdeen. He shakes his head at Greasy Say in mock disapproval and walks off to join his friends. It feels really lovely, and it does illuminate who Katniss might be to the peacekeepers and the people of the Hob, which again, the Hob's an illegal black market. She enters the Hob when she's 11 years old, and going into the Hob, it's illegal, right? You can go to jail for trading in the Hob, and obviously what she's doing by hunting is technically poaching off capital land. So if someone decided to enforce these rules, she would be executed. So it has taken a lot of bravery and courage for her to enter this community in the Hob, and it illuminates who she is inside of it, which is a really important member, an asset to this community, with her own illegal trade run. So this warm exchange between her and Darius it's not an insight that we've ever gotten into Katniss's life before. We really only see Katniss in distress the entire series. Even though there have definitely been extremely hard times, very cold winters, and very lean winters, Katniss did have a life that felt relatively safe, and that did include associations with peacekeepers and people like Greasy Say. Katniss tells Greasy Say that she just can't wait for the whole thing to be over, and Greasy Say says, I know, but you've got to go through it to get to the end of it. Better not be late. Katniss heads from the Hob to Haymitch's. Catching Fire gives us insight into Haymitch's life in a way that we, really didn't get it in the first Hunger Games book. He refuses to let anyone clean his house, and he doesn't really clean it himself. Katniss says when she walks into the house, she's hit by odors of liquor and vomit, boiled cabbage and burned meat, unwashed clothes, and mouse droppings. One, I think this is meant to reflect his feelings toward the mansion that is his Victor home. He regards it as a capital cage at the end of his book, and thus it makes sense that he has no desire to tend to it, nurture it, or maintain it in any way. And we know that Haymitch never had the opportunity to revisit his life, the life he lived prior to the games, because Snow did have his family burned alive inside of that dwelling. So he never gets to return in the way that we've seen Katniss return right here. But also, given that he believes he's responsible not only for the deaths of his family, but again, like most survivors of the Hunger Games, for all the kids that he could not save, so the deaths of nearly everyone he's ever loved, I think it's a punitive behavior. I think he's living in squalor because he thinks that this is what he deserves, or he believes that he doesn't deserve, the comforts of cleanliness, and that's so sad. Katniss has gone into Haymitch's house. She tries to wake him up, and he's not waking, so she dumps cold water on him, and he sleeps with a knife now, and so he swings. Why am I all wet? And she says, look, if you wanted to be babied, you should have asked Peeta. Peeta is regarded as highly observant, kind, compassionate, friendly, gentle, emotionally intuitive. He's extremely articulate. He's self-sacrificing. Peeta comes in with bread and says, ask me what? And just the sound of his voice twists my stomach into a knot of unpleasant emotions like guilt, sadness, and fear, and longing. Because, of course, Katniss, like most hypervigilant, parentified children, feels responsible for the emotions of nearly everyone around her. She recognizes her confusion as it relates to Peeta's unrequited love for her as her fault. She feels it's her responsibility to keep everyone around her from feeling any emotional or physical pain at all times. It's her valuing and understanding of that pain that makes her routine of self-sacrificing behavior so tragic. She would so much rather feel the pain herself than watch anyone around her suffer. And this is really frustrating as well for a number of reasons, because it's not Katniss's responsibility to return the feelings to Gale or Peeta. For all we know, she maybe doesn't like either of these boys, particularly because she re-emphasizes every single book that she has no desire for a boyfriend and no intention to marry. And she does enough caregiving and mothering, honestly. I think about how there was no going back after I took over caring for the family when I was 11. So Katniss's guilt, I believe, is misplaced and unfounded. For Peeta and Gale's part, what I believe they're participating in is a sort of emotional blackmail. So Peeta keeps everyone fresh in baked goods, Katniss hunts, and Haymitch drinks, and that's how they all survive. So Katniss, after enduring emotional blackmail from nearly all angles, heads home, and who does she find there? But President Snow. A small white-haired man who seems vaguely familiar is reading a book at their office in their house. This is perhaps the most unrealistic piece of the novel, that Snow would be reading a book, because people who read typically have empathy, and obviously Snow does not. She's staring into the snake-like eyes of President Snow. She says, if he's here, I'm in serious trouble. And so is my family. We all know that Snow must have really mellowed with age, because it's hard to believe that Katniss's family is still standing. Given the intensity of Haymitch's punishments, like Haymitch's family was burned alive and his girlfriend poisoned at... But perhaps facilitating the explosion in the arena, mocking President Snow, or forcing him to take accountability for Luella's death, and of course drinking the pitcher of milk, perhaps all these things do amount to more punishment in Snow's backwards logic. I don't know. So Katniss recognizes that President Snow is here, and he's pissed because I outsmarted his sadistic Hunger Games, made the Capitol look foolish, and consequently undermined his control. He says, I think we'll make this situation a lot simpler by agreeing not to lie to each other. What do you think? And she's excited about that because she says she doesn't do well with ambiguous threats. She'd much rather know the score. She's sitting talking to President Snow, and just for the mental picture, while she's sitting in a chair, only her toes touch the ground because she is a small girl. She is a girl. So he says, Miss Everdeen, I have a problem that began the moment you pulled out those berries. And this is simply a lie. And herein begins the continuation of Katniss's manipulation from all the people in her life. So we know that Snow is saying this to keep Katniss from further fanning the flames of rebellion, or the spirit of the uprising anyway, because we know the rebellion has been brewing for obviously at least 25 years, but probably the whole time. Because you can't abduct people's children every year and then force them to clap for you without some pushback. Because despite what Dr. Gale and President Snow work very hard to convince us of, people are not inherently submissive. Also, President Snow threatens Katniss by indirectly blaming her for Seneca Crane's death. It's also worth mentioning Seneca Crane is probably a relative of Arachne Crane, who was killed by Brandy, the District 10 tribute, in the 10th Hunger Games. So Snow's just surrounded by a lot of death. So President Snow insists that if he released his iron grip on the districts, the entire system would collapse. And that's probably true, but it's also not the threat that he thinks it is. He talks as if his primary concern is the welfare of the citizens of Panem, when nothing could be further from the truth. We know that Snow is coming from the place of an emotionally stunted, traumatized little boy who has been groomed under the care of psychopath Dr. Gale, and is probably now a psychopath himself. Definitely a psychopath himself. Whatever his logic may be, it's really about his own fear and hatred, like all bigotry and prejudice, and has nothing to do with order, system, or efficiency, progress. It's just all bullshit to back up his fear of poverty and the entitlement he felt to a life of privilege that he did not get to inherit and instead had to steal, earn, whatever word you want to use. So I believe a lot of this is personal, not just because his family's assets were in District 13, not just because his father was killed in action, and not just because of Lucy Gray. Katniss tells him that she didn't mean to start any uprisings. And that's true. And he says, I believe you. Katniss Everdeen, the girl who was on fire, you have provided a spark that left unattended may grow to an inferno that destroys Panem. And he's right, it will. And that's a good thing. Again, not a threat. And it's not Katniss that provided the spark. One, it might have been Lucy Gray that provides the original spark, but we know for sure that Haymitch had a hand in making a few sparks himself. And then President Snow starts threatening Katniss and all of her loved ones, and he says, Gale I can kill off easily if you and I don't come to a happy resolution. You aren't doing him a favor by disappearing into the woods with him each Sunday. And then Katniss starts to think, oh shit, are we being surveilled in the woods each Sunday? But President Snow seems to be implying that Gale and I are in love, and if he really was able to surveil us, surely that's not what he would have seen. And so she wonders if they've been informed on by someone or if there are cameras in the wooded areas. And then she thinks, the idea of losing Gale forever, my best friend, the only person I've ever trusted with my secrets, was so painful I couldn't stand it. Gale took her face in his hands and kissed her. I was completely unprepared. How those hands set the most intricate of snares could as easily entrap me. And as a person, I gotta say, when being kissed, entrapped is really not the feeling that we're going for. She says her hands curl into fists and stay on his chest. She doesn't really embrace him or engage with this kiss. I tried to decide how I felt about the kiss, if I had liked it or resented it. She said it was pointless comparing it with the many kisses I exchanged with Peeta. I still hadn't figured out if any of those counted yet. Does this sound like delayed emotional processing? Anyway, Gale kisses her and sort of like flees, and the next time they meet up, she says that she had this whole speech prepared to tell him that she doesn't want a boyfriend and she's never going to marry, and any feeling that may or may not exist between them doesn't matter anyway, can't be of any consequence because she is unwilling to act on it. But Gale acts as if the kiss never happened. Like, all the responsibility is on Katniss. Gale had shattered some invisible barrier between us, and with it, any hope I had of resuming our normal relationship. So she wanted things to go back to normal, or the way that they were before she left for the games, which was that they were sort of each other's closest confidants and only friends, but they definitely weren't making out. And now he's kissed her, and so there's really no plausible deniability as it relates to the feelings that he has for her. But he hasn't articulated anything. He just keeps being quietly angry and resentful and wounded every single time they meet, so she is like filled with extreme guilt, is supposed to do something about it. She says even though at the end of the last book she got a heads up that she was in trouble with the Capitol, she now thinks, okay, well, what has President Snow seen in the 6 months since the games? To him, it probably looks like I've ignored Peeta completely. It's not her that wants to cut off her relationship with Peeta. It's Peeta that cuts off his relationship with her because she can't return the feelings that he has. But anyway, and flaunted a preference for Gale in front of the whole district. Snow says, I don't care who you actually like or what you do with your time. I only care about how it affects your dynamic with Peeta and thereby affects the mood in the districts, which is obviously, President Snow sucks and is super malicious and insidious. The whole system is insidious, but the forced romance is truly like stomach curdling. Like, why? And I do think that gender is really relevant here, not just because the norms have been switched, but because being in love with Peeta on stage means holding onto his arm, kissing his cheek, right? It does mean leaning on him or presenting herself as more delicate, moving back into the space of the performative or traditional gender roles that makes Peeta look like the protector and her look like the protected or more delicate or weak in some way. So not only is Snow asking her to present herself as a person in love, a person who is driven mad by love, a person whose bravery has no standing or bearing or shouldn't be considered by the people of the districts because it wasn't really bravery, it was lunacy, but also as a little girl. Because I think the truth is, under patriarchy, women are expected to simper to their husbands. That's what patriarchy is. That's why you take his last name. He's tasked Katniss with convincing him that she's in love with Peeta to squelch out any hint of rebellion in the districts, and that is not a doable task. It's just something to distract her. He says this tour will be your only chance to turn things around. So, the victory tour. Katniss, Peeta, Effie, and Haymitch will all be paraded around every single one of the 12 districts and the Capitol, forced to make speeches, accept praise, and attend dinners and parties to celebrate the winnings of their Hunger Games. This is an enormously painful and traumatic or re-traumatizing process for a number of reasons. The main one is that the families of each of the perished tributes will be present. And Katniss is responsible. She's not really responsible, but she facilitated or orchestrated the death of at least 3 tributes. So she'll be forced to stand before the cheering crowds who secretly loathe me, to look down into the faces of the families whose children I have killed. So once President Snow leaves, Katniss is greeted by Effie, Cinna, and her prep team. When it comes to my body, we have no secrets, these 3 people and me. The 16-year-old girl doesn't have any privacy when it comes to these 3 adult strangers. She says that she's bitten her nails to stubs in the past couple of months, and nail biting is a stim, but I know that that's not good enough. I have more. To kick off the tour, there are cameras outside of their home, and so Peeta and Katniss fall into the snow and are forced to kiss on camera. She says she can feel the steadiness that Peeta brings to everything. And Peeta, which also sounds a lot like Peter, means rock. So much like all the other names inside of the book, Peeta's name has meaning too, and it means literally he's her rock. Katniss confides in Haymitch that President Snow has just threatened everyone she loves, and she begs him to help her get through this trip, and he says, "No, Katniss, it's not just this trip." And she says, "What do you mean?" He says, "Every year they'll revisit this romance and broadcast the details of your private life, and you'll never, ever be able to do anything but live happily ever after with that boy. He means there's only one future if I want to keep those I love alive and stay alive myself. I'll have to marry Peeta." Haymitch gives my shoulder a pat and says, "You could do a lot worse, you know." And Katniss interprets this to mean that she could do a lot worse than Peeta, and is like, well, that's not really the point, is it though? Because the point is that she's been robbed of choice and her future. Like we've talked about, she's not politically active and isn't working to rebel against the system of oppression that she's grown up inside of. She's very much accepted it as fact and truth. And so some of what the Capitol tells her, right, even when she's inside the Hunger Games, like that 2 victors can win, she buys without question. And of course, right, like there are career tributes, which are tributes from District 1, 2, and 4 that train their whole lives to volunteer in the Hunger Games so that they can acquire the life of a victor. You're supposed to have your future before you if you survive the Hunger Games, but Haymitch is illuminating how much of a lie that really is, that Katniss never gets off this train, that you never exit the Hunger Games even though you've survived it. So Katniss assumes that this is about Peeta himself, but we now know what he means is you could do a lot worse as it relates to your lot in life, as it relates to your fate post-Hunger Games. Katniss's entire family is alive, and she has not been sold into sex slavery. She probably has the least painful fate of any of the victors that we know about so far. That being said, this is also the moment when Haymitch really starts puppeteering Katniss for the rebellion or his own game. Because yes, he's protecting Katniss by insisting she play by President Snow's rules, but I also think she's revealed herself to be enough of an asset to warrant trust, to have the truth confided in her. Haymitch was immediately brought into rebellious activity by Beetee at the age of 16. He got the opportunity to consent and then participate, paint his own poster, as it were. Katniss being viewed as this unreliable wild card feels quite unfair to me, particularly because she's so enormously powerful and does obviously manage to move folks quite immensely without even trying. And Katniss will eventually feel enormous betrayal because what she has with Haymitch is a trust that doesn't exist between her and anyone else in the world. So when it's revealed that not only is that trust not reciprocal, but she's actually being played, I don't know that that's damage that can be undone. And I don't know, Haymitch, when not sober, does seem to take out a lot of his pain and suffering on Katniss. And I have a problem with that. I don't think that one's trauma excuses the damage they do while they're in pain. I, of course, recognize that Haymitch can't be expected to heal inside of these conditions in a consistently re-traumatizing environment. But when we read the epilogue of Sunrise, it's easy to cast a rosy glow over his relationship with these 2 children when that's really not what it always was. Like, let's not forget he punched Peeta in the face and routinely gaslights Katniss in this second one. And it's not a gentle gaslighting. It's always a gaslighting that's at her expense. It's always him telling her that she has a shitty personality. It's always him telling her that she shouldn't be allowed to make the plans because she doesn't make good plans. Honestly, the way that Snow talks with Katniss is by recognizing her as a threat and saying, I need you to portray something different than that. Haymitch does the opposite. He says, you think you're a threat? You're smaller than that. And that's my issue. Telling her that she has to play this game and be in love with Peeta, that's not the manipulation I'm talking about. It's the deception, the subterfuge, and the gaslighting that I have an issue with. And the implication that her romance with Peeta is at all of any importance as it relates to the rebellion, because it's really not. And she spends a lot of time kissing this boy who she doesn't necessarily like, believing her life depends on it. And I think that that was on Haymitch to help her with. I just do. So this is when Katniss starts to contemplate fleeing District 12, in a similar way that Snow and Lucy Gray contemplated fleeing District 12 as well. She says, "Could I even manage to take everyone I love with me? Start a new life deep in the wild? Highly unlikely, but possible." Anyway, while she's on the train, she spends the morning having the hair ripped off her body while Peeta sleeps in. She's plucked and scoured and massaged and anointed until she's raw. My abused body, my lack of sleep, my mandatory marriage, and the terror of being unable to satisfy President Snow's demands are starting to take a toll on her, as these things will. She says she can't even look at Peeta, my designated future husband, although I know none of this is his fault. Like I said in part 3, I think Catching Fire is definitely a better movie than The Hunger Games, but it lies to you a lot about the sequence of events. And it seems to explicitly focus on action and ignores a lot of the relationship building or like the meat of the book. Katniss ends up snapping at Effie. Effie is going on and on about this like schedule and how important it is that they're on time, which is ridiculous, right? Especially because we know Katniss and life in District 12 is relatively outside of the construct of time. So Katniss ends up snapping at Effie and saying no one cares. That's Katniss's offense, saying no one cares, Effie. Katniss is 16. I want you to think about the things you may have said under significantly less pressure, probably. And she stalks off. This is when Peeta and Katniss reconcile, the damage that has been done by Katniss confiding that she thought everything that happened between them in the games was strategy. And of course she thought that, because if Peeta had disclosed his feelings before being on stage, none of this would have happened, but whatever. Peeta apologizes. He says, "I knew you had something with Gale. I was jealous of him before I even met you," officially. And Katniss doesn't know what to say, but she's like, "There have been times when I honestly didn't know how I felt about him. I still don't, really." Peeta says, "I thought if I stopped being so, wounded, we could take a shot at just being friends." Each of the victors, because they don't have to go to school or have any sort of job, but needs to have something to say to the cameras when their lives are reinvaded by them, is supposed to have a special talent. Katniss's talent is obviously hunting, but they can't put that on TV, so her talent is designing clothes, which just means that Cinna designs clothes and says that Katniss did it. Peeta does have a legitimate talent, though, and that is painting. Now that they are reconciled, he shows Katniss what he's been up to for the last 6 months outside of baking, and it's been painting, and he's painted the games, and he's a very prolific painter, and she says she hates these paintings because he really has brought the games back to life. He says the reason that he painted them is because he sees these things in his nightmares every night. They really do share this trauma in a way that nobody else does, and it's not just the trauma of the games, it's these specific games with these specific tributes and these specific mutts. They have a comfort in one another that no other victor has ever had the privilege of. She says, "Yes, I really hate them, but they're extraordinary." They go back into the train, and Katniss has to apologize to Effie. And she says, to her credit, Effie graciously accepts, and her comments about the necessity of someone attending to the schedule only last about 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Effie sucks. I said it. Then Katniss learns about the other districts, and while District 12 is definitely neglected and starved, mostly what that leaves the people feeling is extremely fatigued. The first stop on the tour, District 11, and this is going to be painful for a number of reasons, but the first things that stand out are, 1, District 11 is enormous. They don't get any indication of population in school, for obvious reasons, but it also seems like they are manned by peacekeepers that are significantly more violent and forceful. There are these enormous fences all along the district, towering at least 35 feet in the air and topped with wicked coils of barbed wire. It makes the fence in 12 look childish because, Katniss and Gale have to go under the fence of District 12 in order to get outside of it, and it's supposed to be charged with an electric current, but it never is, which is why they're able to hunt and keep their family fed, and a lot of the district fed. But here, there would be no escaping. She recognizes that what they see on TV as it relates to the reaping of District 11 can't be even close to a quarter of the population of children here. And so she wonders, like, do they pre-select children and then make sure they're in the crowd? Like, how exactly did Rue end up on that stage with nothing but the wind offering to take her place? She is dressed in a pretty orange frock patterned with autumn leaves, and she thinks how much Peeta will like the color because he has disclosed that his favorite color is orange. Katniss's favorite color is green. They're supposed to get on stage, give these speeches, give a scripted thank you that has been provided by the Capitol, which is just so much rigmarole, so much hoopla for, like, again, it's just all performance. None of it is real. It's just a waste of everyone's time. She also says that it's good form if you knew the tributes of that district to add some personal words, but every single time she sat down to write about Thresh or Rue, the words just couldn't come out. Peeta ends up speaking for both of them and says, knowing it can in no way replace your losses, but as a token of our thanks, we'd like for each of the tribute's families from District 11 to receive 1 month of our winnings every year for the duration of our lives. Katniss is pretty shocked by this, as are the people of District 11. She's not sure if this is legal, and she thinks Peeta probably doesn't know either, which is why he didn't ask, and instead just announced it to the whole world. This is when we learn that 1 month of their winnings will keep both of these families fed for the entire year. Like, this is life-changing money. As they're walking away, Katniss realizes that it would truly be unforgivable, and any of the efforts she made to respect or honor Rue prior to this point would mean nothing if she didn't say anything now. So she looks to Thresh's family and she says, on his side, there's only an old woman with a hunched back and a tall, muscular girl I'm guessing is his sister. She says the careers wanted him to team up with them from the beginning, but he wouldn't do it, and I respected him for that. And he says the old woman raises her head and a trace of a smile plays on her lips because she's proud. And then she looks at Rue's family, her parents whose faces are still fresh with sorrow, her 5 younger siblings who resemble her so closely. The slight builds, the luminous brown eyes, they form a flock of small dark birds. She says, I didn't know Thresh, but the only conversation I had with him led to him sparing my life, and that's a debt I can never repay. But I feel as if I did know Rue, and she'll always be with me. She thanks the district for their children. I raise my chin to address the crowd. And thank you all for the bread. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, someone whistles Rue's 4-note Mockingjay tune, the one that meant safety in the arena. Every person in the crowd presses the 3 middle fingers of their left hand against their lips and extends them to me. An act of dissent from the people of District 11. This is exactly the kind of thing I am supposed to be diffusing. The old man that whistled Rue's tune is murdered. Katniss hears 2 more shots as she's dragged away by peacekeepers. Katniss, Haymitch, and Peeta go up to the attic. Haymitch believes that it's unsurveilled because Plutarch took him there 25 years before. And she tells them everything, finally cluing in Peeta to this situation. She says, I don't even omit the kiss with Gale. I lay out how we're all in jeopardy, how the whole country's in jeopardy because of my trick with the berries. Peeta expresses his frustration that Katniss and Haymitch constantly act as a team and leave him out, and he assumes that it's because they think he's too weak or pathetic to participate in these conversations. And they say, no, it's just you're so reliably good. And he said, well, that wasn't reliably good, was it? Do you think I just helped those families? Do you think they'll survive the day? And Katniss is like, he's right. And Katniss pitches, because it's bound to happen anyway, maybe they should get married. And Peeta consents, but then he walks away and Katniss says, what? I thought he wanted this, which Katniss and Haymitch says he wanted it to be real. AKA, he doesn't just want to be married to you, he wants you to be married to him. Katniss, God. Later at the dinner in District 11, Cinna says, is something wrong, Effie? And she says, I don't like the way we're being treated, because the peacekeepers in District 11 are pretty forceful and aggressive, and they really enforce the rules. And that frustrates me because we know that Effie has been witness to the murder, the slaughter of children for the last 25 years, but she doesn't like the way she's been treated because she's told she can't just walk around the district freely. Like, hello? Like, the lack of empathy is just, it's hard. It's hard to get behind her. It really is. Katniss tells us throughout the rest of the tour, in Districts 8, 3, and 4, there is genuine elation on the faces of the people at the sight of us, and under that elation, fury. When they chant my name, it is more a cry for vengeance than a cheer. And she says she knows there's nothing she could do to ever change this, because this isn't about Katniss and the berries. It's about the ability to defy your oppressor and still be standing. Katniss and Peeta resume their semi-romantic friendship wherein they spend every night in each other's beds and they comfort each other when they wake up from nightmares. She says nothing happens between the two of them, but them sleeping in each other's beds quickly becomes a topic of gossip on the train, and Effie brings it up to her, and I'm like, why is anyone trying to parent these people? And Katniss says, okay, we'll be more discreet, but she secretly hopes it gets back to President Snow. Then, at the end of the tour, Peeta gets down on one knee, pours out his heart, and begs her to marry him. President congratulates her on her engagement. He embraces me, enfolding me in the smell of blood and roses, and plants a puffy kiss on my cheek. Don't kiss her. He also indicates that they have not been successful, that they haven't convinced him, that they failed in their task to quell the rebellion in the districts. Like, oh my god. Katniss says the main thing that she feels is a sense of relief that she can give up this game. President Snow and Katniss joke about how hopefully between the whole Capitol and him, they can get Katniss married before she's 30 because her mom won't want her to get married because she's 16. And Katniss says, "You'll probably have to pass a new law," I say with a giggle. And he says, "If that's what it takes." And that's particularly terrifying because of all the they're at the grandest celebration of all, and it's a party at the president's house in the Capitol, and it's this enormous feast, and Katniss said the food is so good that she can only take one bite of everything because she wants to try everything. And before she's through even a quarter of the table, she's totally stuffed, and her prep team comes up to her and says, "Why aren't you eating?" And she's like, "Oh, I'm totally full." And they're like, "Here, drink one of these." And it's this little glass with a clear liquid in it, and they're like, "Not here, not here." Peeta looks at the glass again and puts it together. "You mean this will make me puke?" And all I can think of is the emaciated bodies of the children on our kitchen table as my mother prescribes what their parents can't give. Peeta says, "Maybe we were wrong, Katniss, about trying to subdue things in the districts." Plutarch asks Peeta if he can steal me for a dance. Katniss says, "I don't want to feel his hands, one resting against mine, one on my hip. I'm not used to being touched, except by Peeta or my family." People with autism spectrum tend to have sensitivities about being touched. And I'm just saying, because obviously we could also chalk this up to not wanting to dance with a game maker, potentially one of the most despicable people in the country. He has this watch, and when he does something to the face of the watch, a holographic Mockingjay appears and disappears. He also says, "I have to go, I have a meeting, it starts at midnight." Katniss is like, "That was weird. There was something clandestine about that." And she's like, maybe he thinks someone else will steal his idea of putting a disappearing Mockingjay on the watch, so now he can't show anyone. Only in the Capitol. No, Katniss. They train back from the Capitol to District 12 for the last victory tour celebration, and Katniss asks Peeta why she never wakes up to him screaming. When she has nightmares, he ends up waking her up and soothing her. And he says, "Well, I don't think I thrash around or scream, and my nightmares are usually about losing you. I'm okay once I realize you're here." And she says, "It's like being hit in the gut. I feel awful, as if I've been using him in some terrible way." Have I? I don't think so, right? Like, Peeta has always had more information than Katniss. To engage in any sort of self-flagellation about her maybe using him feels really... I think Katniss is traumatized and would feel guilt no matter what, and this is something that she points it at. But I don't think she's using Peeta. She feels like she's using him because their performance continues past whatever gets displayed for the country on the cameras, because they are sleeping together. Well, they are cuddling every night, and she does derive a lot of comfort from him, but she knows that she can't give her whole heart to him in the way that he wants. This sounds like all or nothing thinking, but the last party that they have to attend is at Mayor Undersea's house, Mage's house, and not at the Justice Building. And she's glad it's not at the Justice Building, because the Justice Building is, one, where she had to say goodbye to her family during the first Hunger Games, and two, where she accepted a Medal of Valor on her father's behalf after he died in a mining accident. So she says the Justice Building is just too full of sadness. And I think that line's in there because Collins is calling attention to the fact that justice doesn't exist inside of a corrupt system. And so it's too sad to even engage with the pretense of that building. She says she's particularly glad that it's at the mayor's house because her and Mage are friends now. And she says, "We always were, in a way." She says that they both have a lot of free time because Mage's father has to run District 12 and her mother gets fierce headaches that force her to stay in bed for days. We know that Mage's mom is Mara Lee Donner, Maisie Lee Donner's twin sister. As Katniss is wandering through the mayor's house, which she's really familiar with because she spends her time either sharing meals with this family or watching Mage play the piano. She actually even takes Mage out into the woods and is teaching her how to hunt, which is really cool. But as she's looking for Mage, she comes across a television screen that is flashing and says update on District 8. She sees in District 8 a mob scene and peacekeepers fighting civilians. She says peacekeepers were shooting into the crowd, killing at random. She's never seen anything like this before, but she knows this is an uprising. After she sees this, she has to kind of scurry away. She has to remind herself to act normally, act naturally. This is something she does multiple times throughout the book. She has to speak to herself, give herself direction to center herself in the context of the moment, because she becomes so preoccupied with her feelings and with whatever is going on at present. She finds Mage and she's like, yeah, my Mockingjay pin is a real symbol in the Capitol now. Are you sure you don't want it back? And Mage is like, don't be silly. It was a gift, you weirdo. Katniss reminds us that the Mockingjay is more than a funny little bird. It's a creature that the Capitol never intended to exist. It had not anticipated the Jabberjays' will to live. Just as Snow, as an 18-year-old, had not anticipated Lucy Gray's will to live. But more than that, how Lucy Gray's legacy has paved the way for Katniss and Snow's ultimate demise. How Lucy Gray's connection to Tam Amber, to Lenore Dove's connection to Burdock. How Tam Amber is also responsible for crafting the arrowheads that Burdock would eventually teach Katniss to hunt with. How every single one of these pieces has mattered and is now having the reaction that Snow has brought upon himself. More than that, the Jabberjay is the weapon, the tool Snow used to betray his best friend, whose lineage he usurps, steals his family in an effort to amass fortune and power. Everything that we do has an impact, and you can't anticipate what the outcome might be. So though a lot of people in power are being exposed today, and that exposure feels a lot like darkness, what we have to understand is that the reason they're grappling so hard to keep their power, the reason that Snow is so afraid that the districts are going to rebel, is because he knows what will happen to him unless he has complete power. He will be punished and tried or held to justice for the terror that he inflicted and the harm that he did. So more than the Mockingjays being an unintended consequence of the Jabberjay, it's a beautiful unintended consequence of violence. Post the horror of the Victory Tour, Katniss leaves Gale a trail to the lake, which is where her father taught her how to swim. There's a little house there, and she tells us that perhaps house is too liberal of a word. It's really just a concrete hut with 4 walls where her and her father used to hang out. We also know that 65 years prior, this is the site where the rebels in District 12 hid the gun that Snow used to sort of incidentally kill Mayfair. This is where those weapons were stashed, and Snow found them and pretty immediately started hunting Lucy Gray. Successfully or not, still unknown. But anyway, Katniss has left Gale a trail out to this lake because she wants to talk to him. She knows that he's going to feel enormously betrayed by her engagement to PETA that took place on this Victory Tour because they haven't sorted out what they are yet. Whatever. Gale can't seem to put Katniss in the context of her life, and I have an enormous problem with that because what it is the centering of himself in her life, which is just like, it's an interesting little line. She says she sweeps out the snow using a twig broom my father made me when I was about 8. Metaphor? Gale arrives silently at the lake and he is pissed. So he throws the gloves down and he says, I don't want your fiance's old gloves. And Katniss says she knew he wouldn't accept these gifts because of his anger at me. I know exactly how he feels. Didn't I do the same thing to my mom? No, your mom was your parent. Gale is your friend. It would be impossible to wrong Gale or let Gale down in the way that your mother let you down, Katniss, because you're no one's mom. And so she starts with, President Snow personally threatened to have you killed. Gale raises his eyebrows slightly, but there's no real show of fear or astonishment. And he says, unless what? And she says, unless nothing now. Well, thanks for the heads up. She says, well, wait, I have a plan. And he says, yeah, I bet it's a stunner. And he asks her to start from the beginning. And while she's talking and filling him in on everything that has happened since the start of the Victory Tour, he toasts a bread. Mia just feels a little bit reminiscent of the marriage toasting. And he says, well, you really made a mess of things. And she says, I'm not even done. And I really don't feel that Katniss has made a mess of things. I take a deep breath. We run away. This has taken Gale off guard, and he is so excited. He picks her up and spins her around and is like, okay, great, when do we leave? She's like, you don't think I'm mad? And he's like, I do think you're mad, and I'll still go with you, which is an echo of, 9 months ago, Gale pitched that they run away, and Katniss is the one that was like, that's pretty unrealistic and silly to even think about. So he's been waiting to run away with Katniss for a while. I'm completely, entirely, 100% sure. He tilts his forehead down to rest against mine and pulls me closer. His voice drops to a whisper. I love you. It's just like, Gale, stop it. Katniss says, I never see these things coming. They happen too fast. Sounds like delayed processing to me. She says, I know. And you know what you are to me. And he should know what he is to her. She reiterates that all she can think about every day, every waking minute since they drew Prim's name at the reaping is how afraid I am. I do not have room for anything else. She also says that she wants to bring Haymitch and Peeta with her, and he says, I didn't realize how large our party was, and he gets all butthurt about that, and she's like, well, they would torture Peeta trying to figure out where I am. Like, I do have a responsibility to these people now. And he's like, okay, well, what if he won't go? Would you leave without him? And Katniss is like, well, yes, no, I don't know. I'll get him to go. And Gale's like, well, what if I won't go? Would you leave without me? Just if, for instance, I can't convince my mother to drag 3 young kids into the wilderness in winter. Like, all of a sudden he is being rude, and all of a sudden he's working to diminish her intellect, and I understand his defensiveness, and I understand that this is coming from a place of pain, but it doesn't feel like love. It feels like possession. He says, maybe the president's just manipulating you, which is true. But he's basically like, I don't think that the president wants to kill you. He's throwing you a wedding, which we know that Gale is just being obtuse here, because Gale is politically active. He is very socially justice oriented, and so he understands the Capitol and their propaganda. So I find this to be an enormous betrayal and very illuminating as it relates to Gale's character. Gale is at a disadvantage with us as the reader because we start this story or this journey with Katniss when she is developing a relationship with Peeta, but how he behaves following these enormous traumas is also relevant. Katniss says he's not just manipulating me. There's an uprising in District 8, and she wishes that she hadn't told him that because she could see the excitement in his eyes. Gale pushes me roughly away from him. You leave then. I'd never go in a million years. He says it can't be about just saving us anymore. Not if the rebellion's begun. Gale shakes his head, not hiding his disgust with me. You could do so much. When Gale says this, he's demanding action on Katniss's behalf and saying to her that if you're unwilling to sacrifice the lives of your family, you're a coward. And of course, we understand that other victors, namely Haymitch, have had their families sacrificed in the name of the rebellion. We also understand this in the language, nothing you can take from me was ever worth keeping. You have to be willing to risk it all, your bodily harm or harm to your family, if you're going to fight to overthrow a system. Definitely, yes. But Gale is saying Katniss should be more than willing to sacrifice or trade Prim's life for the overthrow of this corrupt system. And that's not his place. It's not his decision to make. More than that, I want to talk about insecurity. Being unwilling to acknowledge how powerful you are diminishes the impact that you can have. If you can't recognize your importance, you're less likely to wield that importance for good. You're less likely to realize that positive impact. You're having an effect on the people around you every single day, all day long. If you can recognize that you are capable of doing good and you are a powerful being simply because you are taking up space on this earth, you'll be more likely to assist. If you believe your opinion is important, you'll be more likely to help. So it's important to know who you are, because without acknowledging your power, you will always minimize the impact that you could have. So that's also what Gale is saying here. But he's also saying that he thinks it's her responsibility to incite a rebellion in District 12 right now. But the reason he's saying that is because she doesn't want to flee with only him to the wilderness. So it's complicated. Then he lets the disgust he feels for Katniss, and obviously Katniss is an unreliable narrator, so we don't know if what Gale is feeling is disgust. I know. He says, I changed my mind. I don't want anything they made in the Capitol. And that's so horrible. I think if you want to hurt somebody who's been through a trauma or who has been forced to grow, the easiest way to do that is to tell them that you liked them better before. Katniss certainly would not have chosen this. She's not a career tribute. And all of the privilege that she has attained, she has worked to redistribute back into the seam, or the most impoverished people in District 12. Does he think I'm now just another product of the Capitol and therefore something untouchable? Gale doesn't have romantic claim to Katniss. He doesn't. doesn't. Anyway, she comes back from the lake feeling like absolute shit about herself, and she runs into Peeta. And she tells Peeta that President Snow was not convinced by her. Not by them, but by her. She says there's an uprising in District 8 and we have to flee. We have to get out. Peeta reacts very differently. He shakes his head and gives me a rueful smile. Sure, Katniss, I'll go. I feel a slight twinge of hope. You will? He says, yeah, I'll go. But I don't think for a minute that you will. She says, then you don't know me. Be ready. As they're walking to town, there's a crowd assembled in the town square, and there's this whistling noise that she can't place. And as she tries to move through the crowd, hands shove her back. Voices hiss. Get out of here, girl. What do you want to do? Get him killed? Why are they saying that? Later association with Gale, Haymitch, Peeta, and Katniss will be frowned upon because of what I'm about to explain, but it is not yet. So I'm wondering what that is about. I don't get that. So what she finds in the square is a new head peacekeeper, not Cray, the guy who was buying white liquor from Hattie Ripper at the Hob this morning, but this is a tall, muscular man with sharp creases in his pants. The pieces of the picture do not quite come together until I see his arm raise the whip. Cray, their old head peacekeeper, was disliked simply because he was a head peacekeeper, but also because he had a habit of luring starving young women into his bed during particularly lean winters. Young women would line up at his door and he would choose one to accompany him that evening. Katniss says she might have been one of these women. Instead, she was privileged enough to, 1, have had access to a weapon, and 2, to learn how to hunt. She sees the new head peacekeeper raise this whip, and she throws herself directly between the lash of the whip and Gale, and she takes the full force of that whip across her face. My hand flies to my shoulder, hungry for an arrow, but of course my weapons are stashed in the woods, because now Katniss has been conditioned to fight back with physical violence. Now, her instinct is to kill this person that's hurting her, because this feels like the Hunger Games. Haymitch arrives and he trips over a peacekeeper laying on the ground. It's Darius. We learn that after about 20 lashes, Darius had stepped in, saying that that was enough. Peeta runs into the situation as well, now because there's 3 people blocking the new head peacekeeper's punishment, and Haymitch is recognizable as a celebrity or a victor in the town, and Peeta is there too. He places Katniss. She was interfering with the punishment of a confessed criminal. I'll get there in a second. And Peeta says he's her cousin. Peeta's got my other arm now, but gently, and she's my fiance. So if you want to get to him, expect to go through both of us. She says perhaps we're the only 3 people that could take this stand. One of the other peacekeepers that Katniss knows from the Hob steps forward and says she believes the number of lashes distributed has been more than enough for the crime he's convicted of, and if the new head peacekeeper believes that this criminal should be executed, they would do that by firing squad. And the head peacekeeper says, is that standard protocol here? And all the peacekeepers shake their head, and they're friends with Katniss and Gale. And Katniss says, I'm sure none of them actually know what standard protocol is, because in the Hob, the standard protocol for someone showing up with a wild turkey is for everyone to bid on the drumsticks. Gale must have shot the wild turkey on the way home from the lake and immediately gone to old Cray's house, as he's done 100 times, knowing Cray always pays well for a wild turkey. But he didn't find Cray. Instead, he found the new head peacekeeper, Romulus Thread. No one knows what happened to Cray. Aligning yourself with an oppressive authoritarian government does not guarantee your safety. Katniss says by the time she showed up, Gale had been lashed 40 times. He passed out around 30. He had told this new head peacekeeper that he had stabbed the wild turkey with a stick, that it had gotten over the fence. If the head peacekeeper had known that Gale had been out in the woods and had weapons and was hunting, he definitely would have been executed on sight. But this, killing a wild turkey when most of the district is starving, is considered poaching on capital land, which just goes to show that it's not about poaching or respecting the rules, it's about ensuring starvation and fatigue. Haymitch and a couple of guys from Gale's mining crew take him to Katniss's mom's house. She's the person that tends to people who have been whipped. Apparently, Katniss doesn't remember there ever being a whipping post in District 12, but Haymitch and Katniss's mom do. Gale's mom arrives, and wordlessly, she sits on a stool next to the table, takes Gale's hand, and holds it against her lips. Because that's her baby. Katniss says she multiplies her own pain once, twice, 40 times, and can only hope that Gale remains unconscious. She's begging her mom to apply more painkiller, and her mom says he doesn't need it yet. And Katniss says, well, what is the worst pain? It's always the pain that happens to be present. Autism. Now, let's talk about Katniss's autistic meltdown, number 1 of this book. She did have an autistic meltdown in the last book, and I'm going to talk about it again, but this one is really, really spelled out for us. Haymitch and Peeta literally carry me from the room while I shout obscenities at her. They have to pin me down on the bed in one of the extra bedrooms until I stop fighting. What's important to know is that an autistic meltdown is not a choice, right? And even the term like autistic meltdown feels really trivializing for what is actually going on here. It's an involuntary submission to extreme debilitating emotion that is going to exercise itself from your body with or without one's permission. Later in the night, once Katniss is more calm and able to function properly again, there's a knock on the door and Katniss assumes it's peacekeepers coming to arrest and execute her or Gale, but it's not. It's Maid. She's covered in snow and she's arrived with a damp cardboard box. She says, use these for your friend. It's from the Capitol. It's called Morphling. And Peeta says, I didn't even know Mage knew Gale. And Katniss is pretty angry about this. She says, what am I angry about though? Not that Mage brought medicine, surely. And Katniss says, no, we bring her strawberries. Like, we know her because we sell game to her dad. She's my friend. And Haymitch says she must have quite a taste for them. And Katniss recognizes that she feels a frustration or even a jealousy at this presumption that something is going on between Mage and Gale. And there are lines in the beginning of the first book to indicate that maybe Mage has had a crush on Gale. But I don't know if that's why she brings the Morphling. Mage has had kind of like an eyes wide open hand in the rebellion that no one is giving her credit for, particularly not the movies because she's erased from them. I don't know. Maybe she brings it for Katniss. Maybe she brings it for Gale. It doesn't matter. But what does matter is that Katniss feels a jealousy that Gale might be having a romantic relationship with anyone else. And this is what flips her switch. After everyone goes home, Katniss is sitting with an unconscious and very beaten Gale, and she imagines their situation in reverse. She imagines Rory's name being pulled in the reaping. She imagines Gale volunteering to take his place. She imagines staying home and watching him participate in a romantic relationship with some unnamed and faceless girl, building a partnership with him, saving each other in the arena, kissing in the arena. She says the hatred I feel for him, for Gale, and for this phantom girl, for everything, is so real and immediate that it chokes me. Gale is mine and I am his. Now, what she's doing is imagining life through his eyes, and that's what leads her to this eventual decision to choose him. When she's viewing life through her own eyes, she's really not sure how she feels, and that matters a lot. In fact, it's other people's expectation that she's meant to love Gale or that they're meant to love each other that leads her to believe that there's supposed to be something between the two of them. Because up until that point, there hasn't been. And it's Katniss's gender that leaves her in this predicament, because what her and Gale had was trust, bonding, friendship, partnership, shared need for survival. And if Katniss had been a boy, they would have been able to maintain their friendship. She even notes in the first games, when she's watching Thresh, as he engages with Caesar during his interview, that he doesn't have to have an interview strategy. Because of his size and stature, he doesn't have to simper to Caesar or play any sort of game. He can allow his training score and his body to speak for itself. In fact, him not playing with Caesar makes him all the more threatening and thus all the more bet-worthy. But Katniss, despite her score of 11, has to become desirable in order to be worth betting on. Katniss, this evening, does a lot more self-flagellation and says she's selfish, she's a coward, she can't believe she hasn't arrived at this conclusion, that obviously Peeta represents the Capitol's plan for her, but who she really wants to be with is Gale. Then she's contemplating why she held out those berries. She said if she held them out because she knew she couldn't return to District 12 without Peeta, then she is despicable. She says if she held them out because she's in love with Peeta, then she's foolish, but not problematic. If she held them out in an act of defiance or rebellion, then she's someone of worth. We do know, because we did have access to Katniss's inner monologue when that happened, that she did not do this to defy President Snow or the Capitol. She did it to defy the game makers who fooled her. To say, I will not play the way you wanted me to play. I was previously going to play, I was following all of your rules, and you decided to pull one over on me anyway, and you won't win. So she did hold them out in an act of defiance, but it wasn't intentional rebellion against the greater system. It was rebellion against the tiny system. She tells us, though, that she doesn't know what was going on with her in that exact moment. And something that's happened is that Gale has become conflated with rebellion, and Peeta has become conflated with capital submission. She sleeps at the kitchen table with an unconscious Gale, and she wakes up to Peeta looking down at her, looking very sad. And she tells him what she said yesterday about running, and he says, "I know, there's no need to explain." And she says, "No matter what I do, I'm hurting somebody." Because the truth is, Katniss isn't trying to make a decision that is going to benefit her, or even trying to figure out who she's in love with, who she should choose, right? Because we know that that is not at the forefront of her mind. What she's trying to do is avoid the consequences. She's trying to avoid pain. Not her own pain, the pain of others. Later, when she's in bed, she wishes that Peeta was there to hold her, but then she remembers that she's not supposed to wish that anymore because she's chosen Gale in the rebellion. Now, she has to reckon with herself that by choosing the rebellion, she is endangering Prim and her mother. And then it hits her that the Capitol has already hurt Prim. They've killed her father in those wretched mines. They have chosen her as tribute, then made her watch her sister fight to the death in the games. She's been hurt far worse than Katniss was at age 12. Katniss says she may have been the catalyst for rebellion, but a leader should be someone with conviction. And she says she's barely a convert herself. While she's choosing Gale because she's in the throes of jealousy from inside his head and he's unconscious on the table, she does kiss him. But when she wakes up in the morning, she hopes that he doesn't remember. Things are complicated enough without the kissing being involved. Anyway, now that Katniss has decided this, her and Haymitch go on a walk. Oh, there was this crazy snowstorm that led to everything being shut down for multiple days. So after 3 days of being sort of imprisoned inside their homes by the snow, Haymitch and Peeta and Katniss all walk toward town. Katniss confides that she'd like to start an uprising, and Haymitch just laughs. He says, Effie called me and asked if I'd like to give you away at your wedding. I told her the sooner the better. What is that? Why are you being so mean? Especially because we're supposed to believe that who he sees is Luella McCoy. And she says, Haymitch, I'm serious. And he says, Katniss, he mimics my tone. It won't work. And then she recognizes why it won't work. 1, District 12 is a lot smaller than all the other districts, but 2, an uprising requires breaking the law and thwarting authority, and this is something that she's become very comfortable doing since age 11. She trades in an illegal market, she goes outside the perimeters of the fence, she owns weapons, and she's proficient in hunting. But unless you work in the mines, you don't really know how to wield any sort of weapon, and you're going to be malnourished and fatigued. Once they do get to town, they recognize that while the rest of the town was imprisoned inside of their homes by the snow, the peacekeepers have really been at work. There's a new gallows in the center of the square, and there's a whipping post. And hundreds more peacekeepers have arrived inside the district. Peeta and Katniss go into Peeta's father's store, and they buy some cakes, and they exchange small talk about the weather. No one mentions the ugly tools of torture just yards from the front door, which speaks to the fact that people of privilege do what they can to avoid the truth about what's going on as it relates to the injustices in their life, in hopes that it will protect them. If they don't acknowledge the horrific things going on outside of their door, maybe they'll be safe from them. They won't. Food shortages begin. Even people with money have no way to access food. They come away from the stores empty-handed. The mines reopen, which is a blessing and a curse. No one is getting paid. Even if they were getting paid, no one could get anything from the Capitol store, so everyone is starving. But when they do reopen, wages are cut, hours are extended, and miners are sent into blatantly dangerous conditions. Something else I want to say that was mentioned in the first book, in a really offhanded way, mentions to us that the reasons the miners have to go so deep is because the people that existed prior to Panem, the people that existed in the United States before Panem was founded, before the nuclear war that almost wiped out humanity, had cleared out all the coal or precious minerals. So the miners, they're going a lot deeper than the miners of present day in our universe. Rory has signed up for Tesserae, which is something that Gale can't even speak about, but it's still not enough. Everyone's very hungry. And Katniss recognizes that the woods are forbidden, the place is crawling with peacekeepers, so she definitely can't come back with game, even to sneak under the fence, knowing how surveilled she is. She recognizes that that would be too dangerous, and ultimately she forbids herself from doing it, but she goes anyway. The reason that she ends up stowing off into the woods is because she's received a shipment of wedding dresses because Snow fully intends to make her go through the charade of wedding with PETA. So she's supposed to be preparing for this wedding photo shoot. She fills her bag with a lot of food. She actually takes steps to mislead her family so they won't know that she's gone to the woods, so they won't worry about her. So her family's gonna think that she's distributing food to the people of the district. As she goes out to the woods, she walks to the lake and she sees that there's smoke coming from the chimney of the little lake house that her and her father used to frequent. There's a fire burning in that hearth. And this is when Katniss meets Bonnie and Twill. First, they say don't shoot, and they show her a cracker with a mockingjay on it. And it's like a damp, gray cracker. And they explain to her that they have escaped from District 8, that when Katniss and PETA came for their victory tour, it was sort of a dress rehearsal for the uprising that they planned to facilitate. There was a fabric factory where the organization for the rebellion took place. Even though the people seemed to be winning the uprising that they did stage, the Capitol flew in thousands more peacekeepers, people were randomly gunned down in the streets, there was a lockdown, everyone was starved, and then after several weeks they were informed that they were meant to return to business as usual, and it was only sort of a fluke debris in Bonnie and Twill's way that led them to not get to work on time, and they watched the factory blow up, so everyone they know was effectively killed. They stowed away in some peacekeeper uniforms that they had put aside and managed to make it to the outskirts of District 12. Where they're going is District 13. Katniss is like, District 13 was blown off the map. We know it wasn't. District 13, with their nuclear arsenal, is able to broker a deal for their independence. They move their entire district underground, and the capital levels the land they used to occupy. We know that District 13 sacrificed all the other districts in exchange for its own sovereignty, but Bonnie and Twill believe that it might exist. And the reason they think it might exist is because the Capitol, whenever it shows District 13 or says it's showing live footage of like the smoking wreckage of nuclear waste that's supposed to be District 13, there's a little glitch in the footage that implies there is no fresh footage of District 13. It's actually the wing of a mockingjay just on the top of the screen. Bonnie and Twill tell her that they think the Capitol leaves them alone because before the Dark Days, District 13's principal industry was nuclear development. And I wonder, since we know that a lot of the Snow's assets were in District 13, is Snow not destroying it because he thinks it's his? Like he's invested in it? And Katniss says, okay, well, even if they do exist, which she doesn't really buy, she thinks these are the delusions of desperate people. She does give them all the food that she intended to pass out to the district, and she actually shows them how to hunt a little bit, but she says, if this is true, why haven't they helped us with the hunger and the killing in the games? She says they're no better than the Capitol. And I don't know if that is true. I don't know if they're no better than the Capitol who's facilitating the hunger and the killings in the games, but it certainly is shitty. After she says goodbye to Bonnie and Twill, she thinks President Snow has been playing me for a fool. All the kisses and endearments in the world couldn't have derailed the momentum building up in District 8. It was obviously a ploy to distract me and keep me from doing anything else inflammatory in the districts. She's thinking about all of this as she's walking back to District 12, and then she hears it, the hum that indicates that the fence that separates the seam from the woods is actually electrified. Power is on. And she says she's been caught outside the fence before, but Gale was always with her, and they could always wait it out. But she wonders if this is a coincidence. Has the power come on because they were waiting for her to leave? Probably. She says, could there be surveillance cameras? I've wondered about this before. Is this the way President Snow knows about the kiss? Katniss has to walk a mile to find a tree tall enough to scale and then jump to another tree to find a branch that has an overhang into the district above the fence. She says to avoid getting fried, she has to be at least 20 feet in the air. She's on a branch that she estimates to be 5 feet higher than that. So she shimmies on to the end of this branch. She gathers her courage and she lets go. She falls into the snow 25 feet. That's so high. She injures her heel and her tailbone and she hobbles back to her house. She knows her family must be worried about her right now. When she gets home, there are 2 peacekeepers waiting at her house, a man and a woman. Her mom says, here she is, just in time for dinner. And Katniss says, I'm very late for dinner. The woman says, head peacekeeper Thread sent us with a message for you. And she says, okay. And they're like, may we ask where you've been? And she's like, easier to ask where I haven't been. Haymitch and PETA are also there. And so they're like, okay, where haven't you been? And she's like, well, I haven't been talking to the goat man about getting Prim's goat pregnant because someone gave me the completely inaccurate information as to where he lives. Prim says, no, I didn't. I told you exactly. They have this funny exchange. She's like, you told me he lived west of the heap stack. Prim says, no, I said east. And Peeta adds, it was definitely the east. He looks at Haymitch and they laugh. Haymitch says, you don't listen to people when they talk to you. Bet people told you he didn't live there today and he didn't listen again. And she says, fine, somebody else can arrange to get the stupid goat knocked up. The man peacekeeper seems to buy this. The woman peacekeeper seems a little bit more suspicious. And they tell her that the gate around District 12 will be electrified 100% of the time from now on. And she says, wasn't it always? Well, no, but now it will be. And she says, okay, well, I'm sure we'll all sleep a little more soundly now that security has addressed the lapse. The peacekeepers leave, and Katniss can't confide all that has happened to her today because she believes her house might be bugged by President Snow. Her mom attends to her wounds, they give her some sleep syrup, and as she's tucked into bed, she says to Peeta, stay with me. I hear him whisper a word back, but I don't quite catch it. She spends the next few weeks bedridden. Peeta comes every day with cheese buns because they're her favorite, and he helps her work on their family book. She describes the various edible plants to him and the various resources that she has come to understand in the woods, and he draws them into the book. She also watches the TV pretty frequently now, which is really unnerving for the people around her because the only thing they play on TV is recaps of old Hunger Games and like mandatory viewing propaganda bullshit. But she's waiting for something. She wants to see footage of District 13. And there is, at one point in time, there is a lady who says she is coming to them live from District 13, and the footage has the telltale Mockingjay up in the corner of it. So Katniss knows it isn't live. And when she shares this with Haymitch, he says, well, there's a lot of reasons why the footage might not be live. It might simply be easier to shoot from wherever they are, maybe spare the expense of actually going to District 13. It doesn't mean that District 13 is alive and well. One day she wakes up to find her prep team all leaning over her, smiling. Creepy. They are complaining about some of the shortages that they've experienced, which happen to be seafood, which is District 4, and electronic gadgets from District 3. So Katniss is pretty certain that on top of District 8, District 4 and District 3 are also in full-scale rebellion. While all of this is going on, while Katniss is grappling with all of this reality-shattering information, she is being forced into gown after gown that all requires different makeup, different hair, different setting for these wedding photo shoots that President Snow is insisting on. She says, I feel like dough being kneaded and reshaped again and again. My mother manages to feed me bites of food and sips of tea while they work on me. Everyone seems really happy with the photo shoot, including Katniss's mother and Prim. They think that I'm safe. It means I'm not going to be arrested because President Snow is clearly investing time into my wedding, so he thinks it's going to happen. The next night, there's mandatory programming, and it's Katniss's photo shoot. We learn that apparently residents of the Capitol were able to vote for their favorite wedding dresses. Like, they're super invested in Katniss's wedding, and Katniss literally didn't even bother to try them on until her prep team showed up. Just shows the discrepancy as it relates to investment in the performance. The people of the Capitol think they're invested in Katniss's love story, but they're really not. The mandatory programming that night is Caesar Flickerman showcasing Katniss's wedding gowns to everyone. Everyone in the country has to watch Katniss lounging around in these really expensive wedding gowns. As pictures of Katniss come up on the screen, I will remind you that she's either 16 or 17 years old at this point. There are some cheers and then some boos for ones that people don't like. Oh my God. After the photo shoot, President Snow comes on the screen and Katniss's mother says it must be the reading of the card. This year is the 75th annual Hunger Games, and Katniss tells us that sometimes when she walks by the school, she wonders which child she's going to have to mentor through it. But the 75th year is a Quarter Quell. This will be the third Quarter Quell in Hunger Games history. The first Quarter Quell to remind the rebels that it was their choice to start the war that caused so much suffering. They had to choose or elect the tributes that would be sent to the Hunger Games, and Katniss wonders if that would be worse, being turned over by the people of your district. The second Quarter Quell, which is the Quarter Quell that Haymitch won, was double the tributes, as a reminder that 2 rebels died for each capital citizen, which is just such backwards whatever. Obviously all of it's backwards, but that's not logical. And this year, as a reminder that even the strongest among them cannot overcome the power of the capital, this year's tributes will be reaped from the existing pool of victors. victors. Katniss doesn't understand what this means immediately, but then it clicks. District 12 only has 3 existing victors. Katniss will be re-entering the arena. This is when Collins lays out autistic meltdown number 2. My body reacts before my mind does, and I'm running out the door. She wants to go to the woods, of course, and she's at the fence before the hum makes me remember how very trapped I am. She says she needs to do something to subdue the hysteria rising up inside of her. It will drown me unless it's released. Somehow she ends up in the basement of an unoccupied house in the Victor's village. She stuffs her shirt into her mouth and she screams until her throat is hoarse. She wonders, is it possible that that was really written on a card 75 years ago? No, it was rigged. It seems unlikely. She says, of course, the victors in the districts are the strongest among the citizens of Panem. They're the only people that have slipped the noose of poverty that strangles the rest of us. It's interesting that she doesn't lump herself in with victors in that sentence. She says the victors are the very embodiment of hope. By the time she's sort of coming to, she wonders how she even got into this abandoned basement. She sees that the glass window has been shattered and her hands are bloody. This behavior that overtook her body was not voluntary. She contemplates how this next game is going to be much worse for the other victors because they've all made friends with the other tributes, whereas the only people she'll have to worry about killing are Haymitch and Peeta. And then she thinks, Haymitch and Peeta? Oh my god, of course I would never kill Haymitch or Peeta. Then she runs to Haymitch's house. Haymitch says Peeta was here moments after they announced this, begging me for another chance to go in. Katniss says, I'm not sure what I'm here for. I'm not sure what I'm here to ask you, but what I really want is a drink. She says the liquor feels like fire and I like it. And she says, Haymitch, maybe you should go in. You hate life anyway. And he says, very true. Haymitch also says, seems like I'm obligated to save the boy this time, given that I chose you last time. Katniss says, shame isn't a strong enough word for what she feels because she didn't immediately come to Haymitch begging to save Peeta's life. And Haymitch says, you could live 100 lifetimes and not deserve him, you know? And she's like, yeah, I know. No one decent ever wins the games. I'm a piece of shit. Like, that's what she gets from literally all angles. Anyway, she says, okay, I figured out what I'm asking. If it is Peeta and me in the games, this time we try to keep him alive. Something flickers across his bloodshot eyes. Pain. And we don't know if that's pain because how could he ever choose Peeta over Katniss, who is Burdock Everdeen, his best friend's daughter, who he has loved since birth. But it also might be pain because he recognizes that he's going to have to lie to her. Because no, he's not going to try to keep Peeta alive at her expense, regardless of the fact that that's what she wants. When she meets up with Gale later, he pulls her into his arms and he says, I was wrong. We should have gone when you said. He says it's not too late. And Katniss thinks, we run, they die, and now I've got Peeta to protect. End of discussion. Yeah, it is. The next day, she wakes up in her bed, she throws up in the shower, she's pretty hungover, and she hears her mom and Prim coming up the stairs. She says they open the door holding tea and toast, their faces filled with concern. I open my mouth, planning to start off with some kind of joke, and burst into tears. They hold me, making quiet, soothing sounds until I am mostly cried out. She says she feels pretty embarrassed about the way she's responded. My erratic flight, drinking with Haymitch, weeping. Given the circumstances, I guess I deserve one day of indulgence, which she does, but we also know, because we had access to inner monologue while it was going on, that none of this was voluntary, that Katniss recognizes that this behavior doesn't seem like her. The next day, Peeta brings the hammer down. He's saying he's now their coach. He's poured out all the liquor that was in Haymitch's house, and he's paid off Hattie for good measure, but also told her that he will inform on her if she sells to either of them. He's like, we're going to start training like careers, and whether or not either of you like it, 2 of us are coming back alive. Katniss says, I don't like self-righteous people. But they do end up training. They both try to put weight on. They do a lot of running. And Haymitch, who used to be the fastest kid in the district, other than Woodbine Chance, now a short run wins him. He's been abusing his body for 25 years, so he doesn't recover as quickly, but Peeta and Katniss get pretty strong. Gale even comes in and he helps them on Sundays, and he teaches them about snares. He also says to Katniss, he says, it would be better if he were easier to hate. And Katniss is like, no, I know. She's like, no, I get that. You're the one that doesn't get that. If he were easier to hate, I would have come home and been a happy little victor all by myself and there wouldn't be a rebellion. None of this would be happening. Thereby, Katniss is sort of taking responsibility for the fact that all these victors are now going to be expected to compete in the games again. She does feel responsible for this, or that this is a punishment directed at her. And Gale says, "And where would we be, Katniss?" She wonders, would he have still kissed me? I don't know. Would I have kissed him back had I been free to do so? She knows that she wants to tell Gale how essential he's been to her all these years, how much better my life has been for knowing him. And as Reaping Day is approaching, she has figured out what she wants her last words to her loved ones to be, but she saves them for those last goodbyes after the reaping. Effie says ladies first, and she draws Katniss's name from the bowl. Then she catches Haymitch's name. He barely has time to shoot me an unhappy look before Peeta has volunteered to take his place. So, Haymitch is finally, legitimately, reaped in the Hunger Games. Her dying words are, "Don't you let the sun rise" on the reaping. Haymitch is the last tribute to be reaped in the Hunger Games. Peeta volunteers to take his place, and once again Katniss and Peeta are the star-crossed lovers from District 12. Thread seems to delight in telling Katniss that they have a new procedure and she is not allowed to say goodbye to anyone in her family. I'm left staring out the window of the train watching District 12 disappear, with all my goodbyes still hanging on my lips. And this time, she has no hope to return. Peeta says Katniss will write letters. These words were meant to go with embraces and kisses, and a stroke of Prim's hair, and a caress of Gale's face, and a squeeze of Mage's hand. She says she sits by herself, thinking of them one by one, releasing them like birds from the protective cages inside of me, locking the doors against their return. She said goodbye to everyone she loves in District 12 in her mind, and she's fully prepared to walk toward her death. She watches the recaps of the reaping with Haymitch, Effie, and Peeta. I think there are only 2 volunteers in this game. Brutus from District 2. I'm not sure if the woman from District 2 is also a volunteer, but I don't think so. And the only other volunteer is Mags, an 80-year-old woman who needs a cane to walk to the stage. Mags, who won the 11th Hunger Games and mentored Haymitch to his victorhood, volunteers for Annie Cresta, a hysterical young woman with flowing brown hair. There's also, in District 8, a woman named Cecilia, who looks about 30. She has to detach herself from 3 kids who run up to cling to her. These are the tributes that Katniss notes when she's watching the reaping. Katniss and Peeta resume their semi-romantic relationship, sleeping in the same bed every night, cuddling on couches, because she said goodbye to Gale, and now anything that happens between them, he'll think is just acting for the cameras, so she's sort of free from Gale's expectation and from his guilt. Peeta says, "I don't think the people in the Capitol are going to be all that happy about the victors going into the arena." She doesn't really have time for the feelings of the people of the Capitol, but there's some truth to what Haymitch has said, because it's clear that the people of the Capitol aren't going to be able to forget that their victors, who are ultimately the only celebrities in the nation, are humans. So they don't want to see them fight to their death. They decide to watch Haymitch's Hunger Games, and we know exactly how that goes. Everything in this arena, Haymitch quickly deduces, is poisonous, even the air. She points to her ear and says, "Find Haymitch," so that he is forced to utilize resources keeping her alive. He actually ends up going to a gas plant and using his flint striker to make a sort of like makeshift flamethrower and kill a lot of the butterflies that are zapping him. Amper has also had virtually no food, so Haymitch shares his resources with Amper as well. Execute BT's plan, and Haymitch does blow up the water tank that's underneath the arena, effectively drowning the brain. They were programmed for Amper, and for Amper alone, the mountain in the far corner of the arena explodes. Turns out it's a volcano. Haymitch ends up killing 2 career tributes, acting in self-defense and acting on desperation instinct. He asks nasally if she would be his sister, and she says yes. And obviously it's more proof that the games were rigged. Like, we lose 3 newcomers to the stupid porcupine bear thing. 2 game makers, 2 very young game makers in their signature white outfits. You know who else is also there is Silka, in a tribute from District 4. She ends up walking away and is pretty immediately killed by candy pink birds. It's the same pitcher as the pitcher of milk that he drank when President Snow asked for milk. And he watches, breathless, for what the love of his life would call poetic justice, as the axe comes back and sinks itself into Silka's head. Haymitch is officially the sole survivor of the Quarter Quell. They say it seems like a major invasion of Haymitch's privacy, even though it was obviously broadcast to all of Panem, but they agree not to tell Haymitch that they saw it, and it's the only other quell that they have access to, so they think it's good for studying. When they're watching Haymitch's games, the only reason that Katniss doesn't identify her father next to Haymitch is because we know the reaping had been retaped because Haymitch's name was never originally drawn from the bowl. Peeta does note Katniss's mother clinging to Maisley Donner as she ascends the stage. She says her Mockingjay pin means something different now, completely different now, that she knows its former owner was Mage's aunt, Maisley Donner, a tribute who was murdered in the arena. She says, "It's hard to admit, but Haymitch was young and strong once. He was also something of a looker. His hair dark and curly, those gray seam eyes bright and even then dangerous." The next day is, of course, the chariot ride that is the opening ceremony of the Hunger Games. She finds herself in the position of having to console her prep team, who are crying over her because they really don't want to see her go back into the games, and they seem to believe that she's definitely going to die, which is interesting because it seems like Katniss is really maybe the strongest contender as it relates to who could be the victor. her, and their understanding that she is probably going to die implies that they know she might be in trouble in some way. I'm not sure. Cinna's costumes for Katniss have abandoned the pretense of girlhood, and now he's dressing her, particularly for this chariot ride, as some unearthly being who looks like she might make her home in the volcano that destroyed so many in Haymitch's Quell. Goes down to the chariot area, and she's hanging out with the horse of her chariot, even though the scene is quite social this year because all the other victors know each other. And she says, I'm not really the sort of person to go around introducing myself. And she is approached by Finnick Odair. Finnick Odair is lusted after in the capital because he won his games at 14 and he's super gorgeous. In the games, he received a silver parachute with a trident, which may be the most expensive gift I've ever seen given in the arena, and it was all over. He's lethal with the trident. Finnick seems to be trying to intimidate her with his body. He's like mostly naked because it seems like his stylist thinks the more the people see of Finnick's body, the better, because he's so handsome and such a perfect specimen. There are a lot of words to describe Finnick in this book. But all of the victors seem to be attempting to manipulate Katniss or working very hard to make her uncomfortable. I'm not sure why this is. Maybe it's because they think she is responsible for them all being pulled back into the games. Are they blaming her for President Snow's retaliation that they are ultimately becoming collateral damage in? Are they feeling her out and trying to get a rise out of her because she is, perhaps the biggest threat in the arena? They seem to poke a lot of fun at her and Peeta's romance because they believe it to be entirely fake. It will be revealed to them that obviously Katniss does love Peeta. So Finnick is doing this thing where he seems to be trying to seduce her, and she says she's not seduced at all. In fact, who she's reminded of for some reason is old Cray, luring starving women into his bed. And that's really cool foreshadowing because the reason she's reminded of Cray is not because Finnick is in Cray's position, but because he's in the position of the starving young women. Katniss says Finnick was protected for the first 2 years because he was only 14 when he won, but as soon as he turned 16, he spent his times at the games being dogged by those desperately in love with him. Not in love with him. He can go through 4 or 5 people in an annual visit. Poor Finnick. Peeta comes to save her, and Cinna and Portia have given Katniss and Peeta instructions to be unforgiving, no smiling, no waving, and Katniss says, I love it, getting to be myself at last. As they're on the chariot and they're holding hands, she says, there is a part of me that's not so brave, that's very glad that it's Peeta here with me instead of Haymitch. When they get off the chariot, Haymitch is hanging out with Cedar and Chaff, the 2 tributes from District 11, and Cedar immediately pulls Katniss into a hug. I know somehow it must be because of Rue and Thresh. Before I can stop myself, I whisper, the families? They're alive, she says back softly before letting me go. And then Chaff gives Katniss a big kiss right on the mouth. I jerk back, startled, and Haymitch guffaws. What the fuck? And then, when they get in the elevator, Joanna Mason comes in and strips entirely naked Joanna Mason from District 7 while maintaining conversation with Peeta and Haymitch. When everyone else gets out of the elevator and it's just the 3 of them left, Katniss flings Peeta's hand away because she can sense that something's going on, but she's not entirely sure what it is, and she feels very much like it's at her expense. It's you, Katniss. Why they're all acting like this? Finnick with his sugar cubes and Chaff kissing you and that whole thing with Joanna stripping down. He says, you're so pure. He says, for me, you're perfect. They're just teasing you. And she says, no, they're laughing at me and they're trying to manipulate me and it's not cool and you're a part of it. And before they can really dive into that conversation, they walk into their penthouse and Effie says, looks like we got a matching set this year. She's referencing the Avoxes that are meant to serve the tributes of District 12. The Avox girl is a redhead that Katniss knows from last year. Before Katniss was reaped in the Hunger Games, she actually met this Avox girl who seemed to be fleeing from the capital. Katniss and Gale were hunting in the woods, while 2 teenagers are running through the woods, fleeing capture. A Mockingjay makes a single note, a warning call, and then all of a sudden a capital hovercraft appears. The boy is immediately killed, but the girl is apprehended by the capital. But before she's apprehended, her and Katniss lock eyes. The redhead girl is beamed up, so to speak. Katniss is plagued by guilt because she did nothing to intervene and save the girl, who is now an Avox. An Avox, which is a capital prisoner whose tongue has been mutilated in her mouth so that she can no longer speak. In Katniss's first games, she notes the Avox girl immediately, and she sort of like tipsily, drunkenly acknowledges the girl and says, how do we know each other? Which it would be impossible for them to know each other outside of any sort of illicit contact. And Peeta swoops in and saves her. This is relevant for two reasons. One, Katniss assumes the Avox girl hates her because she did nothing to save her, but the Avox girl eventually relieves her of this guilt and is like, seems to communicate, what could you possibly have done? You would have just been mutilated and made a slave as well. But before that conversation can happen, Katniss has a meltdown during the first games where she ends up throwing plates around her room and crying uncontrollably. The Avox girl helps her clean up, dries her tears, and tucks her into bed. The second reason this is relevant is because the second Avox standing next to that redheaded girl, I noticed the young man beside her, another Avox, also has red hair. I know him from years of easy conversations in the Hob, joking over Greasy Say's soup. It's Darius, peacekeeper from District 12. Haymitch grips my wrist as if anticipating my next move, but I am as speechless as the Capitol's torturers have rendered Darius. President Snow has so obviously placed him here for my benefit. They obviously can't talk to each other, but during dinner, Katniss sends a dish over the table and gets under the table to help clean up, and Darius is there and they clench hands tightly for just a moment. That night, watching the chariot display, she wedges herself between Haymitch and Cinna. She's still mad at Peeta for joining in with the other victors and making fun of her for being prude. She's also triggered by the Darius situation. She recognizes that Peeta is not Hob, Peeta is town. The chariot ride has probably the intended effect, making the victors look pitiful, because it's one thing to put kids in costumes, but it's a whole other thing to put aging adults. Haymitch tells Katniss and Peeta that this year their strategy has to be entirely different and they have to team up with the other victors in the arena. And Katniss says, I don't want any allies. Why would anyone team up with us? They've all been friends for years. There's nothing we could do to get inside of that friendship. And Haymitch says, that's not true. You're extremely liked by the citizens of the Capitol, which means you're going to have a lot of sponsors immediately, and you're intense competitors. So they're supposed to be spending training finding allies. But Katniss has already been made very uncomfortable by most of the tributes that Haymitch maybe would have wanted her to team up with. So she does not want that. She spends her first day in training at the knot tying station, where she's remembered fondly by the trainer, and he regards her as an advanced pupil. Finnick seems to be trying to get Katniss's attention. He's doing this from a bunch of different angles, seemingly recognizing that he's potentially messed up the first day, or maybe what he did when he was trying to like seduce Katniss or make her uncomfortable was just exacerbated by Chaff's kiss and Joanna stripping naked, because Finnick hasn't been particularly aggressive with Katniss, but he really is spending a lot of time around her. Eventually, he introduces her to Mags, and Katniss really likes Mags. Her and Katniss have something in common. Mags volunteered for Annie Cresta. Obviously, Mags doesn't think she can win, so she feels like her and Mags probably have some form of camaraderie. They've both sacrificed themselves for people they love. She also spends time with BT and Wyrus, the two tributes from District 3, and the reason that she does that is because she's pretty sure they're not going to strip down naked to make her uncomfortable. She says both are small in stature with ashen skin and black hair. They, in code, talk about the way rebellion might be going on. Katniss asks about the loss of production, and BT says, has District 12 also experienced a holdup in production? And she says, no, nothing major. We lost a couple weeks when they brought in a new head peacekeeper and his crew. And she says, I feel bad knowing that their district must have suffered much worse than ours. I feel I have to defend my people. So she says, we're very small. There's not a lot we can do. It's in this conversation with BT and Wyrus that they point out the chink in the armor, the force field that is now between the tributes in training and the game makers overseeing training. A patch of space about 6 inches square at the corner of the table seems almost to be vibrating. And they say to each other, I wonder what brought that on. And Katniss says, me probably. Last year I shot an arrow at them during my private training session. BT and Wyrus look at me curiously. I was provoked. Then there's lunch. Katniss plans to eat by herself, but all the other tributes are dragging the tables together, so they all have to eat as one group. A nightmare. And she's like, even at school I used to avoid eating at a crowded table, but Peeta was always surrounded by a group of friends. When Peeta and Katniss talk, she says that the people that she wants to team up with are BT and Wyrus. And he says, really? There's something of a joke to the others. Joanna Mason calls them nuts and bolts. And Katniss says, why does that not surprise me? And knowing what we know now about the Brewing Rebellion, probably the reason that the others are regarding them as a joke is because BT is likely the brains of the rebellion operation, so that's probably a cover, but it pisses Katniss off, understandably. And she says, okay, so I'm stupid for thinking they might be useful because of something Joanna Mason said. And if we have to have allies, they're who I want. She tosses like a soup ladle back into the soup and splatters them both with gravy. And he's like, what are you so angry about? Because I teased you on the elevator? I'm sorry. I thought you would just laugh about it. And what's frustrating about this is that this teasing that the other victors are doing is designed to make Katniss uncomfortable in an already horrific situation, and it's a bunch of people teaming up on her. It is mean-spirited, and it's in an area that she's not necessarily sensitive about, but seems to be regarded as a weakness. And I also want to say, if an adult man who in 3 days, if I run into him, is going to attempt to kill me, kisses me on the mouth, I wouldn't think it was a joke, because it's kind of an assault. And two, it's not that Peeta was laughing at her, it's that he was laughing along with them, right? He's not protecting her, and we understand her love language to be protection. It's an invalidation of how deeply this is like hurting her, and his lack of understanding, compounded by the Darius of the situation, because Gale probably wouldn't be laughing about this. So it just also indicates that Peeta isn't Gale and doesn't understand her in the way that he does. I get it. But she says Chaff isn't so bad at lunch when he's sober. He talks too loud and makes jokes a lot, but most of them are at his own expense. Katniss recognizes that now she has to tell Haymitch who she wants for allies are Nuts and Bolts and Mags, which is Haymitch's exact team during his Quarter Quell. Katniss ends up shooting a few arrows with the trainer at the archery station, and she kind of loses herself in the shooting. She turns and sees the majority of the victors have stopped to watch me. Their faces show everything from envy to hatred to admiration. When she gets back that night, Haymitch says, so at least half the victors have instructed their mentors to request you as an ally. I know it can't be your sunny personality. Rude. And Peeta says they saw her shoot. Actually, I saw her shoot for real for the first time, and I'm about to put in a formal request myself. She tells him who she wants, BT Wirus and Mags, and he says, of course you do. And Katniss interprets this to be sarcasm, but it's actually Haymitch commenting on their similarities in personalities as it relates to who they're willing to trust. Of course, commenting on the echo that this entire fiasco is turning out to be. She says after her shooting exhibitions, she still gets teased, but not nearly as much, and it doesn't feel like she's being mocked in the same way. And then after 3 days of training, we get to the space where they have to demonstrate their skill for the game makers, and this feels like something of a joke to everyone because one, the game makers already know what they can do. They've seen them participate in and win a previous Hunger Games, but also now, like, we've got an 80-year-old here. Mag says maybe she's just gonna take a nap for 15 minutes. Katniss says to Peeta, why did Haymitch want us to get to know these people? It's going to be so much harder to kill them, and we know that that's exactly why Haymitch wanted them to get to know them. We find out for Peeta's training session, he actually paints a picture of Rue covered in the flowers Katniss had put her in immediately after her death, and that Katniss ends up stringing up a dummy and painting Seneca Crane on it because she wants to prove to the game makers who look so safe and so cozy up there that they aren't actually safe at all. And the reason Katniss decided to string up Seneca Crane is because she knows that Peeta must have done something pretty intense, and she's trying to keep him alive at her own expense, and she can't do that if he's pissed off the game makers and made himself a target, so she's trying to make herself more of a target. After that, Katniss and Peeta both receive 12s for their scores so that the other tributes have no choice but to target them. The next day is a day that they're supposed to be training for their interviews, but given all the ways that they've been trained by the Victory Tour in the previous year's Hunger Games, Effie and Haymitch give them the day off, and they spend the day on the roof of the Tribute Center having a picnic, braiding flower crowns, playing a game where they toss an apple at each other, and it's a really lovely, romantic, calm and peaceful day. And Peeta says, I wish I could freeze this moment in time right here. And Katniss says, okay. And he says, so you'll allow it? She says, I will. The next day, when she's being prepared by her prep team for the interview, as her prep team starts to break down and cry, directed by Cinna, the prep team is not supposed to cry in front of Katniss because she doesn't want to be in a position where she has to console them about her death. 2 members of her prep team end up having to excuse themselves, and then it's just Vienna. Almost rigid with determination, she does my hair and nails and makeup, fingers flying swiftly to compensate for her absent teammates. The whole time, she avoids my gaze. And once she's finished, she looks at Katniss and she says, we would all like you to know what a privilege it has been to make you look your best. My foolish, shallow, affectionate pets almost break my heart with their goodbye. For her tribute interview with Caesar Flickerman, Katniss is dressed in a wedding dress, specifically picked out by President Snow. Cinna says his objections were ignored. When she greets the other tributes, they all say something along the lines of, "Give him hell." She says this is the first time she recognizes the depth of betrayal felt among the other victors, and the rage that accompanies it. These victor tributes spend their interview launching a very calculated attack at President Snow and the Capitol, wielding, manipulating the emotion of the people of the Capitol like they have been trained and forced to do to try to get the games canceled, or to make a statement about the games. Using their various strengths, they appeal to emotion, they question the legality, they put their fury on display. Depending on who the tribute is, they authentically present their case about why this games shouldn't be happening. And that maybe the only reason it is happening is because President Snow doesn't know how badly everyone would be hurt by it. When it's time for Katniss's interview, the audience is in such a wreck about her in her wedding dress, which has clearly been designed to undermine her strength. They have lost it. Katniss gets ultimately no time to speak with Caesar Flickerman, which is okay because she's been speaking with Caesar Flickerman for the last year, basically. Cinna had told her not to raise her arms above her head until he gave her the signal. And he does give her the signal. Katniss spins, and her wedding dress, in flames, burns up until it leaves only a dress that reveals her as the Mockingjay when she spreads her wings. Katniss knows that this is something that Cinna will likely be punished for. Then it's time for Peeta's 3-minute interview. He tells Caesar that Katniss and him are already married, that in District 12 they have their own little ceremony where they make their first fire and toast a bit of bread and then share it. This is interesting because in this book we've seen Gale and Katniss share toasted bread. We also know that what brings Peeta and Katniss together is Peeta burning or toasting bread. Caesar says, well, maybe this is positive. Surely just a little bit of time together is more than none. Maybe I'd think that too, if it weren't for the baby. When I read this in the 8th grade, and I had to put the book down and I screamed aloud. He's done it again. He's dropped another bomb. Katniss is pregnant to the people of the Capitol. The audience begins to sound like a herd of wounded animals, moaning, shrieking, calling for help. And Katniss thinks, well, couldn't it be true? Isn't it the thing I dreaded most? About the wedding, about the future, the loss of my children to the games? When Peeta accompanies Katniss up at the back of the stage, tears run down his face as she takes his hand. Is this acknowledgement that he's been stalked by the same fears as her, that every parent in Panem has been? All 24 tributes stand in an unbroken line, joining hands, in the first public show of unity since the Dark Days. The camera cuts out, the audience is dismissed, everyone is sent home, and Katniss and Peeta don't get to say goodbye to Effie. Haymitch tells them that the interviews have been canceled as it relates to the re-airing mandatory watch for Panem. The night before the games, Peeta asks Haymitch if he has any last words of advice, and he says, stay alive. Then he looks at Katniss, and he seems to be looking at her with accusation in his eyes. Katniss, when you're in the arena. And she's like, what? You just remember who the enemy is. Katniss and Peeta spend that night together, and then the next day they're separated. Katniss is brought to her launch room, the stockyard. She's dressed by Cinna, her Mockingjay pin adorned to her uniform or outfit. He tells her, remember, girl on fire, I'm still betting on you. Katniss enters the tube. It comes down and separates the two of them. And while she's expecting the plate to rise, waiting to enter her doom, nothing happens. She keeps waiting and she keeps waiting. 3 peacekeepers burst into the room. 2 grab one of each of Cinna's arms, and the 3rd beats him with metal-studded gloves. Then her platform is raised. Ladies and gentlemen, let the 75th Hunger Games begin. She can't make sense of her surroundings because she is entirely surrounded by water. And if you don't come from a district where water is readily available to you, you would not know how to swim. The only way to get to the cornucopia or to any of the beaches is by swimming. Katniss has one thought before the gong sounds. This is no place for a girl on fire. Katniss dives into the water, makes it to the cornucopia first. She has an arrow notched in her bow, and she says she's alerted by, I don't know, a soft shift in sand, or maybe just a change in atmosphere. Incredible senses. And turns to find Finnick, glistening and gorgeous, a trident already in his hand. He says, that's interesting that you know how to swim. And she says, we have a big bathtub. They're at sort of a standoff, and he says, lucky thing we're allies, right? And that's when she notices the gold flaming cuff on his wrist. Katniss, Effie, Peeta, and Haymitch all have something gold to reflect their unity. Katniss has her Mockingjay pin, Peeta has a gold pendant that Katniss doesn't know about yet, and Haymitch had this bangle that she regarded looked more like a handcuff than anything else. But now it's on Finnick's wrist, which tells Katniss that Haymitch must have given it to him. This is an order. You're teamed up with Finnick. Peeta is stranded on his metal plate because not only does he not know how to swim, but he also has an artificial leg. He's at a pretty significant disadvantage in this arena. Finnick and Katniss argue about who's gonna go tow Peeta in, and Finnick ends up winning and goes by himself. He reaches Peeta and is towing him back, one arm across his chest. Mags also makes her way to Peeta and Katniss, and Peeta tells Finnick that Katniss wanted her on the first day, and he says Katniss has remarkably good judgment. So this is the first time we've actually ever heard anyone say anything like it's kind of nice about Katniss. They flee, they run into the jungle, and they keep moving forward and forward and forward. First avoid the slaughter, then find water. They're looking for water. Katniss scales a tree to try to get a vantage point and hopefully see some water. As she doesn't find water, what she does see is pretty extreme bloodshed at the cornucopia. She says it looks like the ground is bleeding. While she's up there, she is confounded. She thinks you all pretended to be friends and now you're killing each other. And she thinks she should just get it over with Finnick. Just shoot him immediately when she goes down there because there's really no future in this alliance. Finnick seems to intuit what she will have seen when she scaled that tree, and so when he comes down, not only is he braced with his weapon, but he seems to know how it will have affected her, that she may now attempt to kill him. So he says, what's going on up there? Taken a vow of nonviolence? Toss the weapons into the sea in defiance of the capital? And he says no, because no one is a victor by chance. Except maybe Peeta. And then maybe the two maybe strongest contenders in this games are at a standoff. Peeta steps in between the two of them, and Katniss thinks, move, you idiot. But he remains there. And so they all continue forward. Katniss thinks, okay, well, I guess I'll just have to kill Finnick in his sleep. She recognizes that it's despicable, but it speaks to her grander plan, which is to get Peeta out alive. As they continue to move into the jungle, she thinks that maybe killing Finnick would have been a little bit premature because it's clear that he knows more about the Hunger Games and more about these other victors than she does. He's a pretty enormous asset to have on one's team. Peeta is leading the way and Katniss is bringing up the rear, and as he's leading the way, he's having to slash away the growth of jungle in front of them in order to clear a path. And as he raises his sword to slash, Katniss sees the chink in the armor that Beetee and Wyrus had pointed out to her in training. She knows that Peeta's about to hit a force field. She yells out for him to stop, but it's too late. His knife hits the force field and he rebounds backwards. She screams Peeta and she goes to him. She puts her ear to his chest, expecting to find his steady, strong, beating heart that she always sleeps on, but all she hears is silence. His heart has stopped. Finnick tosses her away from Peeta's body and she goes to fight him. She notches an arrow again and is about to release it when she sees Finnick put his lips to Peeta's, and she says it's so weird, even for Finnick, that it stops her in her tracks. Then she recognizes that what Finnick is doing is CPR on Peeta, which would be a pretty unheard of thing because what Finnick is doing is bringing back to life a tribute in the Hunger Games who must die in order for him to win. So it doesn't make any sense. Just when Katniss accepts that Peeta has moved on, that he's dead, unreachable forever, he gives a small cough. His lashes flutter open and his eyes meet mine. Careful, he says weakly. There's a force field up ahead. Katniss laughs. They embrace. She's worried about him. She's crying a lot. Finnick keeps saying, like, yeah, it's just because she's pregnant. It's just the hormones because she's pregnant. That's why she's always crying. And she's like, Finnick keeps playing the pregnancy card for me, and that's really nice because I'm not pregnant. She says she feels really vexed about Finnick's efforts. All she wanted to do was keep Peeta alive, and she couldn't, but Finnick could, and now how is she going to kill him in his sleep? Finnick says, you knew that there was a force field up ahead. How? And she doesn't want to reveal how because she's afraid that the game makers will find a way to conceal this advantage. So she says that she can only hear it out of her reconstructed ear. And she says, perfect. Now all the attention will turn to the surgeons who fixed my deaf ear after the games last year, and they'll have to explain why I can hear like a bat. That first night, there are 8 pictures in the sky. Most notable tributes to Katniss are Cecilia, who had 3 kids, and Cedar, who'd shown her a lot of kindness. They've been killed in the bloodshed. They all sit down to rest. They haven't been able to find any water, but eventually their sponsors send them a spile. Parachute comes down. Finnick says, why don't we let Peeta claim it, because he died today. And Finnick is just lovely. The first meeting is not an amazing first impression, but he becomes extremely endearing very, very fast. They're sent a spile. Katniss figures out that they'll use it to tap a tree. They get some water. Mags recognizes some of the nuts in the jungle. Katniss is really no help here as it relates to herbs and edible food because she's not familiar familiar with this landscape. Katniss is on guard and all the others are sleeping when the fog starts to intervene. This fog has not only a paralyzing effect, but like an acid burn effect. They all need to sprint out of this section of the jungle. They don't know that it's about this section of the jungle, but they need to move quickly. Peeta has an artificial leg and he died today, so he's very, very slow. Finnick is carrying Mags on his back, and eventually it gets to a space where they have to trade. Finnick carries Peeta and Katniss carries Mags, the 70-pound, 80-year-old woman on her back. But not only does the fog have a paralyzing effect, it also makes all of their muscles spasm, so none of their arms are working correctly. Eventually, after enough falls, it's clear that maybe all 4 of them are going to die here because Katniss can't carry Mags. She begs Finnick to carry them both, and he looks at her with agony in his eyes and he says, "I'm sorry, I can't, my arms aren't working." And so Mags, without a second thought, kisses Finnick and runs straight into the fog. Her body seizes and she dies immediately. All 3 of them have to run so that her death is not in vain. Eventually, they find their way to the beach, and the fog does not overtake them, even though several times in the fog, Katniss was pretty sure they were going to die. She's extremely grateful that she didn't kill Finnick, because how else would she have gotten Peeta out of the fog? This is another suspicious event. Finnick abandoning his mentor from the games and his tribute partner to carry Peeta, Mags sacrificing herself for Peeta. Their faces and their bodies have gone numb, and even though it stings a lot, when they put their bodies in the water, it releases some of the fog, so they have to drag Finnick, who has taken the worst of the fog, maybe because he was the biggest or exerted the most energy, into the water. He starts to register that he's being helped, and they all get a minute of reprieve before the monkeys situation starts. Peeta goes into the jungle again, maybe an hour or 2 later, and starts to tap a tree. Katniss and Finnick notice that he is surrounded by monkeys in the jungle ahead of him. They are mutations. They're not regular monkeys. The monkeys launch an attack that is extremely violent and is extremely aggressive. Katniss is launching arrow after arrow. Finnick has lost 2 of his tridents in the fog debacle. They're already depleted because they had to run through the jungle. They didn't get any sleep. They've barely had any water. Katniss is out of arrows, and Peeta is left vulnerable to attack because he is handing her more arrows when a monkey launches itself at his chest. Katniss knows that she'll be too late and she's about to lose Peeta when a tribute from District 6 launches herself in front of the monkey, takes the monkey's teeth into her chest, sacrificing herself for Peeta. Peeta and Katniss wait with this woman, the Morphling, until her death. Katniss, Peeta, and Finnick all wait on the beach. The wounds from the acid have left them scabbed and extremely itchy, and so Katniss calls up to the sky, "Hey Mitch, if you're not too drunk, we could really use some medicine," and immediately a can of medicine comes down. It makes them look really ugly, and Haymitch and Katniss have this exchange that leads her to believe that maybe Finnick Odair is alright, or at least not as vain or self-important as she thought he was. Later, after resting on the beach, Peeta, Katniss, and Finnick see 3 bright red figures emerge from the jungle, stumbling, coughing, moving about. It's actually Joanna's aggressive shoving of Wyrus that leads Finnick to identify her as Joanna. Katniss immediately defends Wyrus, and Joanna jumps down her throat and says, "I got them out for you." Katniss, and we as the reader, understand this to mean that Joanna thinks that if she wants to ally with Katniss, she needs to have Wyrus and Beetee on her side, because those were people that Katniss originally wanted as allies. But we know now, after finishing the book, that is just a cover for the rebel plot as to why Joanna would be protecting, again, the brains of the operation. Beetee is entirely passed out, so unable to translate for Wyrus, who, if we remember, had been tortured sometime during Sunrise on the Reaping for facilitating Haymitch's eventual return home. So when she talks, not everyone can understand what she's saying when she talks. So she's saying things like tick-tock, tick-tock over and over again. Katniss pieces this together because of her conversation with Plutarch. It starts at midnight, and Wyrus says tick-tock that the entire arena is a clock, and each section of the arena, based on the hour it is, launches a whole new set of horrors. So we know 1 o'clock is lightning, 2 o'clock blood rain, 3 o'clock acid fog, 4 o'clock monkeys. Joanna fills them in on what their time in the arena has been like. She said that Beetee almost died trying to get this wire coil, and she's like, "I don't even know what it could be used for. It can't really be a weapon. I guess you could bash someone in with it." And Peeta says, well, he won his games by electrocuting everyone in the arena. And Katniss says, there's something suspicious about Joanna not putting this together. She says, you'd think you'd know that, given that you nicknamed him Bolts. And Joanna says, yeah, that's really stupid of me, wasn't it? Because Katniss is poking holes in the rebel performance because she's not brought in on it. Because they know the arena's a clock, she gets everyone to move to the cornucopia. And while they're at the cornucopia sorting out what the arena might look like, they are attacked by the career tributes. Cashmere and Gloss are killed by our little group of allies, and Wyrus is killed. Then the cornucopia starts spinning, and at the time, Katniss thinks they've spun it to try to disorient the tributes that have figured out their silly little clock arena, but we know that it's Plutarch spinning it because if all the careers die right now, then the ally ship has to start attacking one another. This is when Katniss starts to put the pieces together. She's like, something is going on that I don't understand. Finnick towing Peeta in from the water. Finnick reviving Peeta. Mags running into the fog so that Finnick could carry Peeta. The Morphling who sacrificed herself for Peeta. Then Finnick, in this last altercation with the career tributes, Finnick blocks Brutus's sphere from hitting Peeta, even though it means taking a knife in the leg. Some of the other victors are trying to keep Peeta alive, even if that means getting hurt themselves or dying themselves. She thinks, why would that be? And then she thinks, well, maybe they've arrived at the same conclusion that I have, that no amount of brute strength is worth what Peeta's tongue is, that Peeta could turn the tide in favor of the rebellion with a single sentence. Maybe that makes him more worthwhile than all the other tributes in this arena. Maybe Haymitch has convinced everyone here to sacrifice themselves for Peeta. That's not what's going on. Immediately after this, Katniss and Finnick are assaulted by the horrific sounds of their loved ones screaming for help. There's this new section of the arena, the Jabberjay section. Finnick and Katniss have gone in to tap a tree. Once you're in this section, it keeps you stuck in this section. So you just have to sit and listen to the screams of your loved ones while they are tortured. Katniss recognizes immediately that the screams are coming out of Jabberjays, that it's not the people she loves. Prim, her mother, Gale, Mage, Rory, Vic, even Posey. But it's Finnick who says, well, how did they get that sound? Jabberjay's copy. By the time that hour is over, Peeta is comforting her, and he says, we're down to the final 8. What happens at the final 8, Katniss? And she says, 7 more of us die. And he says, no, really, what happens? They interview your friends and family, and they can't do that if they're dead or they've been tortured, right? Can they do that if they've killed them all? Those are just sounds. That didn't really happen. And Katniss says, you really believe that? And he says, I really do. And then she thinks of how Peeta can make anyone believe anything, so she's not sure if she should trust him. And Finnick says, could they do that, BT? Could they manipulate their voices to make it sound like they were screaming even if they weren't? And BT says, yeah, we teach kids how to do it in grade school. It's really easy. Just another horrible thing. We learned that the person that Finnick was tortured with was Annie Cresta, the girl that Mags had volunteered for. Peeta and Katniss sit on the beach back to back, Peeta with his eyes on the jungle and Katniss with her eyes on the sea. Peeta engages Katniss in a conversation about what they're both trying to do, how they are at odds with one another, both with fatal agendas to ensure the other remains alive. He says, I don't know what kind of deal you think you've made with Haymitch, but you should know he made me promises as well. Peeta shows Katniss the locket that he's had Effie arrange for him. It has a mockingjay on it, and when you open this pendant, on one side is a picture of Prim and her mother, and the other is a picture of Gale actually smiling. And she knows that what Peeta is saying, this last ultimate gift, I want to give you your life and I want to give you your future with Gale, that you will have a family if you move forward. He says, nobody needs me, Katniss. And she says, I need you. I do. And I think that's true. They end up kissing, and she says, instead of satisfying me, these kisses have the opposite effect of making me hungrier for more. They end up going to sleep that night, and she says she wakes up with this delicious feeling of happiness that she knows must have something to do with Peeta. This is when BT launches into what is effectively the rebel plan and is ultimately a large electrical snare. They're going to use his wire to run it from the lightning tree to the beach to fully electrify anything that gets wet by the 10 o'clock wave. They all are like, okay, well, none of us understand this plan, so we obviously can't say anything about it. So they're all going to the top of the jungle to get to the lightning tree, and Finnick says Katniss should go first. She can hear the force field. And BT's like, hear it? And Katniss is like, guess who I'm not fooling with that story? Anyway, so they're setting up this plan, and eventually it's down to something that only BT can do, which is like arranging the wire in a very specific way. And so they kind of get the afternoon off. So they all compile a seafood feast. Each day they've been sent bread, initially from District 4 and then from District 3, with 24 rolls each. And every single time they're sent bread, Katniss is like, Finnick is obsessed with counting this bread. Like, why is he always counting it? But anyway, so they have lots of bread, bread. They dive down below, get some oysters, and Peeta opens one of the oysters and he finds a pearl. He says, hey, look at this. He holds up a glistening, perfect pearl about the size of a pea. You know, if you put enough pressure on coals, they turn to pearls, he says earnestly to Finnick. And Finnick says, no, they don't. And they both crack up. They think about how Effie in the first games told everyone that if you put enough pressure on coals, it turns to pearls because she is ignorant. She doesn't know what she's talking about. But the point is the same. Beauty that arises out of pain. Peeta rinses off the pearl in the water and hands it to Katniss. And he says, for you. And she thinks, yes, this is a gift that I can accept. She thinks she'll hold on to it when she dies in the arena. Another round of rolls from District 3. Finnick, of course, immediately counts them. This is so funny because it's obviously Suzanne cluing us in more into the fact that something is going on that Katniss is not aware of, but it also has the effect of making Finnick seem obsessed with bread. And that's hilarious because Suzanne Collins has named her fictional nation Bread. So funny. Katniss says, I have the pearl secured in a parachute with the spile. Surely my mother and Prim will know to return it to Peeta before I am buried. So they're about to enact this rebel plot. BT insists that Joanna and Katniss take the wire down to the beach, laying it all throughout the jungle. He says, you need to go now and you need to go quickly if you're not going to be electrocuted by the lightning tree. Peeta protests and BT says, I'm sorry, this is the only way. This is all we have time for. Peeta, you're simply not fast enough. Katniss says, it'll be okay. She takes Peeta's face in her hands and says, don't worry, I'll see you soon. And she gives him a kiss. And then she goes. As she's laying the coil with Joanna, they both turn around and find that it has been snapped. They're about to be attacked by Brutus and Anabaria. And before Katniss can pull her bow, she is smashed in the head with the coil. Joanna has hit her in the head with the coil. Katniss finds that when she comes to, she can't breathe, and that's because Joanna is sitting on her chest, cutting into her wrist. Stay down, hisses Joanna, and then her weight leaves my body. Stay down, I think. Then she hears Brutus's voice. She's as good as dead. Let's move. It takes every ounce of will I have to push up into a sitting position and drag myself up to the lightning tree. She's looking for Peeta. She needs to save Peeta. She understands that something has happened and now a free-for-all has been triggered and everyone is going to kill each other until a last victor is standing. She recognizes because she's been attacked by Joanna that her and Finnick must have had a deeper alliance, and thus if she can't trust Joanna, she now cannot trust Finnick. Just as she decides this, Finnick barrels through the jungle shouting, Joanna, Katniss, but Katniss remains concealed. She makes her way toward the lightning tree where she finds an unconscious BT. It's clear that he's tried to drive his knife into the force field somehow, and it's knocked him out. She hears Peeta calling her from somewhere far away in the jungle, and she thinks, okay, well, all I can do is distract whoever is attacking him. So she starts shouting out, I'm here, to try to entice his attacker to come attack her. Just then, Anabaria comes through the trees, and Katniss has her arrow pointed at her neck, and she thinks this is the best I can do, leaving Peeta with one tribute to kill. But then she's hit with a memory. It's Haymitch scowling at her. Katniss, when you're in the arena, you remember who the real enemy is. And she thinks, of course I know who the real enemy is, who starves and tortures and kills us in the arena. And it's not Anabaria. So she rises, turning to the force field, fully revealing herself, but no longer caring. Her bow tilts up at the wavering square, the flaw, the chink in the armor, where BT probably would have driven his knife if he could have reached it, and she shoots. This blows the force field on the arena wide open. Katniss is blown backwards and eventually passes out. She comes to when she is being lifted up into a capital hovercraft, and she's terrified because she knows that she has not survived to be crowned victor of this Hunger Games. No, she's going to be tortured or made an example of. Her fears are confirmed when the person that greets her at the top of this hovercraft is Plutarch Heavensbee. And because she is ultimately comatose, but her eyes are open, he shuts her eyes, sentencing her to darkness. When she comes to, she recognizes that she's been healed. She's been stitched up. She has IVs in her arm. She grabs a syringe and she's gonna try to find Peeta to kill him before the people of the Capitol can torture them. She sees BT and she thinks that she should just kill him right now too, but she doesn't because she's afraid that his monitors will start beeping and the Capitol attendants will be alerted before she can get to Peeta. So she doesn't kill BT. She'd been brought in on the plan. That wouldn't have been something we have to worry about. She hears a conversation behind closed doors between Plutarch and Finnick. He's saying something about communications being down in 7, 10, and 12, but 11 has control. Finnick is begging them to go back for Annie, and Plutarch says, I'm sorry, we simply cannot. Finnick says something along the lines of, maybe I should just die, and she hears someone say, as long as you're alive, they'll keep her alive for bait, says Haymitch. Katniss barges into the room and finds Plutarch, Finnick, and Haymitch all sitting around a command table of sorts. And he says, done knocking yourself out, sweetheart? He notes the syringe in her hand and he says, see, this is why no one lets you make the plans. They have her sit down and they explain to her that the minute that the Quell was announced, there was a plan to break these victors out of the arena. Tributes from 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, and 11 had varying degrees of knowledge about it. The bread that they received in the arena was code for the time of rescue. The district where the bread originated from indicated the day, and the amount of rolls indicated the time. That's why Finnick was always counting them. The hovercraft they're in right now belongs to District 13, that does in fact exist and is in fact alive and well. Meanwhile, most of the districts in Panem are in full-scale rebellion. That's a lot of information to receive. Like, a lot has happened in the last 20 minutes of Katniss's life, basically. Katniss says, it's an awful lot to take in, this elaborate plan in which I was just a piece, just as I was meant to be a piece in the Hunger Games, and I agree. Katniss says, why didn't you tell me and Peeta about this? And Haymitch says, because we knew as soon as the force field blew that you guys would be the first people that they attempted to capture, and the less you knew, the better. And Plutarch says, we had to save you, Katniss, because you're the Mockingjay. And while you live, the revolution lives. The bird, the pin, the song, the berries, the watch, the cracker, the girl on fire. Peeta, I whisper, my heart sinking. The others kept Peeta alive because if he died, we knew there'd be no keeping you in the Alliance. Where is Peeta? He was picked up by the Capitol along with Joanna. Haymitch, who of all people in this rotting world has turned Peeta and me into a piece in his games, he has betrayed us. He has betrayed me. And of course no one lets me make the plans, because obviously I can't tell a friend from an enemy. Haymitch and Katniss are both screaming terrible, terrible things at each other, and Finnick is trying to drag her out. All I can think of is Peeta lying on a similar table somewhere while they try to break him for information that he does not have. Katniss is sedated routinely. Finnick tries to talk to her while she's in a state of sedation. She says, I don't answer. Finnick Odair's good intentions don't mean anything to me. She says they can pump whatever they want into her arm, but it takes a lot more than that to keep a person going once she's lost the will to live. One day she wakes up and the face above hers is Gale's. She knows that something horrible must have happened if Gale is now on this hovercraft. She asks about her family and he says, Prim and your mother, I got them out in time. And she says, got them out? They aren't in District 12? As if saying it will somehow fend off the truth. But Gale is not one to keep secrets from me. Katniss, there is no District 12. My name is Sage. Thanks for watching. Next time.